The first time I saw the door, it was exactly where it shouldn't have been. I'd lived in my apartment building for 5 years, and while it wasn't glamorous, it was predictable. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a faint smell of someone else's dinner always hanging in the hallways. There were 12 units on my floor, and every door was the same. Cheap wood with peeling paint and brass numbers nailed crookedly at eye level. Mine was 403. So, when I stepped out of the elevator one night, balancing a bag of groceries in one hand and my keys in the other, I noticed the difference immediately. There was a new door where there hadn't been one before. It was at the far end of the hallway, beyond Unit 412, in a space that had always been blank wall. The door itself was old, far older than the rest of the building. It was made of dark wood, its surface scarred with deep gouges and scratches, as though something had been clawing at it for years. The number plate was missing, replaced by a tarnished brass knocker in the shape of an open eye. I stood there, staring, my keys forgotten in my hand. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. Renovations, some maintenance work I hadn't noticed, maybe an unused utility closet finally being converted into a unit. But I knew that wall. I knew that hallway. The door wasn't supposed to be there. I told myself not to care. It wasn't my problem. Whatever was happening in this old, creaky building wasn't my responsibility to understand. Still, as I walked to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that the door was watching me. That night, I dreamed of scratching sounds. Faint at first, like the whisper of tree branches against glass. Then louder, more insistent. By the time I woke up, the sound was so real I half expected to find claw marks on my bedroom walls. But the room was silent, bathed in the pale blue glow of morning. I didn't think about the door again until a few days later, when I came home from work. This time, there was a sound coming from behind it. Faint, muffled, but unmistakable. It wasn't music or talking, nothing I could clearly identify, just a rhythmic thumping, like something heavy hitting the floor over and over again. The hallway was empty, and none of my neighbors seemed to notice or care. I considered knocking, asking whoever was inside to keep it down. But as I approached the door, my skin began to crawl. The sound was louder now, almost like a heartbeat, pulsing in perfect rhythm. I leaned in closer, pressing my ear to the wood. "Help me." The whisper was so faint I almost missed it. A voice, barely audible, trembling with desperation. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. For a long moment, I stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the hallway was still. The sound stopped. I told myself I imagined it. Stress from work. Too much caffeine. But when I turned to walk back to my apartment, I noticed something new. A scratch on my door. It wasn't deep, just a thin, jagged line running diagonally across the wood. I ran my fingers over it, my stomach churning. There was no reason for it to be there. Nothing nearby that could have caused it. But it wasn't just the scratch that bothered me, it was the angle. It pointed directly back to the strange door at the end of the hall. Over the next few days, the scratching sounds came back. They started faint, late at night, as if something behind the door was pacing endlessly, claws dragging across the floor. I tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on my TV or drowning it out with music, but it didn't help. No matter what I did, I could hear it. And then the smell began. It started as a faint, acrid tang, like burnt hair or plastic. By the second night, it was stronger, more nauseating, a mix of rotting meat and wet soil. I called the building manager, demanding an explanation. "There's no door there," he said flatly, as though the conversation bored him. "What do you mean there's no door?" I snapped. "I'm looking at it right now." He sighed heavily. "You've lived here a long time. You know there's nothing at the end of that hall." I hung up, furious, but his words stuck with me. Later that night, I went online, searching for old blueprints of the building. He was right, or at least, the documents supported his claim. There was no door, no extra room, just a blank wall where I knew the door stood. I couldn't sleep. At 3:15 a.m., the scratching stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it startled me awake. I sat up in bed, listening. Nothing. Not even the usual hum of the building's pipes or the creak of its old wooden floors. And then I heard the knock. It was soft at first, just a polite rapping. I froze, staring at my bedroom door, willing it not to open. The knock came again, louder this time. "Let me in," a voice called. It wasn't muffled. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside my apartment. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked up. I forced myself to move, grabbing my phone from the nightstand and dialing 911 with trembling fingers. No signal. The knock came a third time, so loud it seemed to shake the walls. "I know you hear me." I don't remember getting out of bed, but suddenly I was standing in the hallway, staring at the door to my apartment. The scratch was deeper now, splitting the wood like an open wound. The voice was louder, clearer, but it wasn't coming from behind my door anymore. It was coming from the door at the end of the hallway. The eye-shaped knocker was moving, its brass surface flexing like living flesh. I ran. I don't know how I got out of the building, but when I reached the street, the night air felt sharp and cold against my skin. I called the police from a payphone 2 blocks away, and when they arrived, I tried to explain everything. When they entered the building, there was no door. The wall was blank, just like the manager had said. They didn't believe me. No one did. I haven't been back to my apartment since. I stay at a motel now, moving every few days. But it doesn't matter. The scratches are still appearing, on doors and walls and mirrors, and I can hear the knocking no matter where I go. I think it's getting closer. The first time I realized something had shifted, it was because of the birds. I was sitting on my balcony early one morning, sipping coffee and watching the city wake up. A group of pigeons had gathered on the power line across the street, their gray feathers glinting faintly in the pale sunlight. They shuffled and cooed, their heads darting in that nervous, mechanical way pigeons always seem to move. Nothing unusual. But then, one of them froze. It wasn't subtle, like a bird pausing to preen or listen. It was absolute. Mid-flutter, its wings locked in place, a jagged sliver of its body suspended above the wire. I leaned forward, my coffee sloshing over the rim of my mug. As I stared, another bird froze, and then another, until all 6 pigeons on the line were statues in mid-motion. My first thought was that I was imagining things. Maybe I'd blinked too long, or the early light was playing tricks on me. But the world around the pigeons continued as normal. Cars rolled past on the street below, a jogger thudded by with rhythmic breaths, and the hum of morning life droned on. The pigeons stayed frozen. Then, just as suddenly, they moved again. Not slowly or tentatively, but all at once, as though nothing had happened. Their wings flapped, their heads bobbed, and they scattered into the sky, disappearing between the rooftops. I sat there, unmoving, the warmth of the coffee long forgotten. I wanted to believe it was just an anomaly. Birds are weird. Maybe there was a logical explanation. There wasn't. The second time, it was the sky. 2 weeks later, I was walking to the grocery store when I noticed the clouds. Puffy and white, they stretched lazily across the horizon like spilled cream. But as I approached the crosswalk, they flickered. It was brief, almost imperceptible, like an old video glitching on a screen. One moment, the clouds were there. The next, they blinked out and returned slightly askew. It wasn't until I stopped walking that I realized something else had changed. The sun had moved. It had been low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, but now it was directly overhead, as though hours had passed in an instant. I checked my phone. The time hadn't changed. I didn't mention any of this to anyone. How could I? There wasn't a way to explain it without sounding unhinged. Still, the unease stuck with me, growing like a shadow behind every normal moment. Soon, the anomalies stopped being subtle. I was at work one day, sitting in a dull meeting about quarterly reports, when it happened again. My manager, Helen, was droning on, pointing at a chart on the screen. I wasn't paying attention, my focus drifting to the clock on the wall behind her. At first, it looked normal, a plain analog clock, its second hand ticking steadily. But then the hand stopped. It hung there at the 12 for a moment, vibrating faintly, before it began moving backward. Tick, tick, tick. My breath hitched. I looked around the room to see if anyone else had noticed, but my co-workers remained transfixed on Helen's presentation, oblivious. The second hand continued its backward march, spinning faster and faster until the entire clock seemed to vibrate. Then, with a sharp click, it returned to normal, the second hand ticking forward again as though nothing had happened. That night, I stayed late at the office, waiting for everyone else to leave. The building was silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights. I approached the clock, dragging a chair beneath it to get a closer look. There was nothing unusual about it, just a cheap, mass-produced clock, its hands moving in steady precision. I took it down, turning it over in my hands, searching for some hidden mechanism or clue that could explain what I'd seen. And that's when I found the note. Tucked into the battery compartment was a scrap of paper, yellowed and brittle, with a single phrase scrawled across it in jagged, looping letters. "You're too close." My hands shook as I stared at the note. I shoved it back into the clock, returned it to the wall, and left the office without looking back. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. Objects began appearing in places they didn't belong. My keys on the roof of my car, my toothbrush on the kitchen counter, the same stranger on every corner of the street no matter where I turned. I once caught my own reflection in the mirror smiling at me before I could smile back. Then came the looping. One night, I was walking home from a late dinner with friends. The streets were mostly empty, and a light drizzle had begun to fall. As I turned a corner, I noticed a street lamp flickering just ahead. Its light sputtered weakly before going out entirely. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing faintly against the wet pavement. But as I turned the next corner, I saw it again. The same street lamp, the same flicker, the same slow fade to darkness. I stopped, my chest tightening. This wasn't possible. I retraced my steps, only to find myself back at the same street lamp. No matter which direction I walked, I ended up there, caught in a loop that defied all logic. Finally, I stopped under the broken light, staring up at its dull, lifeless bulb. "What do you want?" I whispered to the empty street. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from behind me, a voice answered, "Not you." I spun around, but the street was empty. The light flickered back on, steady now, as though the loop had never existed. When I got home that night, my apartment felt different. The walls seemed too straight, the air too still. I walked to the living room and froze. There was someone sitting on my couch. It wasn't a stranger. It was me. This other version of myself was wearing the same clothes, sitting in the same position I had been in the night before, right down to the mug of tea balanced on the armrest. They didn't acknowledge me, their gaze fixed on something unseen, their expression blank. I approached cautiously, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Who are you?" I asked. The other me didn't respond. Instead, they turned their heads slowly, their movements unnaturally smooth, and smiled. "You were never supposed to notice," they said. Then, in an instant, they were gone. The next morning, the anomalies stopped. The world was quiet, ordinary. But it wasn't the same. The shadows felt too long, the air too dense, as though the fabric of reality had been stretched too far. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the faint hum of the static, waiting just beyond the edges of the world I thought I knew. I never thought I'd take a job as a night courier, but there I was, weaving through dimly lit streets in the dead of winter. The company, Swift Dispatch, specialized in confidential deliveries, legal documents, lab samples, stuff too sensitive for FedEx. The pay was decent, and I liked the solitude. I wasn't much for small talk, and nights were peaceful. Or at least, they were supposed to be. It was the kind of cold that got into your bones, and I'd been out since 8 p.m., working my usual route through downtown. Around midnight, the dispatcher sent me a new job, a pickup from an address I didn't recognize. "Priority package," he said. "Needs to be delivered by 3 a.m. No exceptions." The address was a good 20 miles outside the city, down a stretch of rural highway. I almost refused. Late-night pickups in the middle of nowhere weren't exactly my favorite, but the bonus on the job was too good to pass up. I punched the address into my GPS. No name, just coordinates. The app directed me down increasingly narrow roads until the pavement gave way to gravel. My headlights illuminated tall, skeletal trees on either side, their branches swaying against the night sky. The signal on my phone flickered, then vanished completely. The house appeared suddenly, perched at the end of a long driveway like a secret someone had tried to bury. It was tall and narrow, its windows dark, the paint peeling from its walls. A single porch light glowed faintly, the bulb buzzing in the quiet. I pulled up, killed the engine, and stepped out, my breath clouding the air. No one answered when I knocked on the door. I tried again, louder this time, the sound echoing through the stillness. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the shadows. He was older, his face pale and gaunt, his frame thin as if he'd been hollowed out. "You're here for the delivery," he said, his voice low and rasping. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. He nodded and disappeared into the house, leaving the door open just wide enough for me to see inside. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the walls lined with photographs in frames. I couldn't make out the details, but something about the way they hung, crooked and uneven, felt wrong, like they'd been moved and never put back properly. The man returned with a package, a box roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in brown paper and secured with thick twine. He held it out to me but didn't let go when I grabbed it. "Don't open it," he said, his pale eyes locking onto mine. "Don't look inside. Just deliver it." "Got it," I replied, though my stomach tightened at his intensity. He hesitated, then let the box go. As I turned to leave, he added, "Stay on the main road. Don't stop, no matter what." I didn't respond. I just got back in the car, set the box on the passenger seat, and started the engine. The house disappeared in my rearview mirror as I drove down the long driveway, but the unease it left didn't fade. The GPS rerouted me to a new destination, this one even further out of the city. I glanced at the clock. 1:20 a.m., plenty of time to make the delivery. I turned on the radio, hoping for some company, but all I got was static. The box sat there, silent, but it felt heavier than it should have been, as if it were taking up more than just physical space. Every so often, I'd glance at it, fighting the irrational urge to unwrap it and see what was inside. I didn't, of course. I had rules. I followed them. About 20 minutes into the drive, the road narrowed, and the trees pressed closer. My headlights caught glimpses of movement, branches swaying, shadows shifting, but I told myself it was just the wind. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the gravel. The figure didn't move. It was tall and cloaked, its face obscured by darkness. For a moment, I thought it might be someone in trouble, a stranded traveler or a hitchhiker. But as I rolled down the window, I noticed something strange. There were no footprints in the snow around them. I called out, but they didn't respond. Instead, they tilted their heads slightly, as if listening for something. Then, without a sound, they turned and walked off the road, disappearing into the woods. I didn't stick around to watch. My heart hammered as I pressed the gas and sped away, the box rattling on the seat beside me. The road stretched on, empty and endless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind me. No headlights, no movement, just darkness. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, coming from inside the car. I froze, gripping the wheel tighter. The tapping came again, sharper this time, like fingernails against glass. It was coming from the box. "Don't stop," the man had said. But how could I ignore this? My hands trembled as I reached for the box, but just as my fingers brushed the twine, the tapping stopped. The car filled with silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. I left the box alone and kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. When I finally reached the delivery address, it was nearly 3 a.m. The building was an old factory, its windows boarded up, its facade crumbling. A single light flickered above the loading dock. I parked, grabbed the box, and approached the dock. A woman stepped out of the shadows to meet me. She was dressed in black, her expression blank, her eyes scanning me like she was searching for something. "You have the package?" she asked. I handed it to her, and she inspected it carefully, running her fingers along the twine as though checking for tampering. Satisfied, she nodded. "You're done." That was it. No explanation, no signature, just a dismissive wave. I didn't argue. I wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. As I drove back toward the city, the sense of relief I expected never came. My chest still felt tight, my mind racing with questions. What had been in the box? Why had it tapped? Who, or what, had been standing in the road? I quit the job the next day, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear tapping, soft and insistent, coming from somewhere just out of sight. I never check to see where it's coming from. I don't want to know. I moved into the old house on Sable Lane because it was all I could afford. The landlord, a wiry man with two bright eyes, handed me the keys with the kind of smile that's meant to seem reassuring but isn't. "It's a good house," he said. "Solid. Just don't go messing with the basement. You don't need to be down there anyway." I didn't plan to test him on that. Basements had always unnerved me. The smell of damp stone, the dim lighting, the way the air seemed thicker underground. I shoved the thought aside as I walked through the house for the first time. It was plain but sturdy. Creaky wood floors, walls the color of oatmeal, a faint smell of paint lingering in the corners. I should have felt lucky, but the house didn't feel empty. It wasn't anything obvious. No phantom footsteps, no flickering lights. But there was a density to the air, a quiet that seemed too deliberate. I chalked it up to nerves and unpacked. The first night passed uneventfully, except for the dreams. They came on vivid and sudden, like they'd been waiting for me. In the dream, I was standing at the top of a staircase that spiraled down into darkness. I couldn't see the bottom, but I felt something moving below. Not footsteps or breathing, but a pulsing, as though the ground itself had a heartbeat. I woke drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around me. The house was cold. The thermostat read 70, but the air felt closer to 50. I wandered through the rooms, flicking on lights, checking windows. Everything was locked. Still, the chill clung to me like damp clothes. It wasn't until I reached the kitchen that I saw the first mark. A small, smudged handprint on the wall beside the pantry. It wasn't mine. The fingers were too small, the shape slightly distorted, like the hand had pressed too hard or not hard enough. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just old grime from the last tenant. But when I rubbed at it with a wet cloth, the mark wouldn't fade. I decided not to think about it. The second night, the dreams returned. This time, I was at the bottom of the staircase. The walls around me were damp, slick with something that smelled metallic. The pulsing was louder now, resonating in my chest. Ahead of me was a door, wooden and warped, its surface carved with symbols I didn't recognize. I woke before I could open it. The handprints multiplied after that. Every day, there were more. Along the baseboards, around the windowsills, on the bathroom mirror. Always small, always slightly smudged, as though the hands that made them weren't quite real. They didn't feel like a message. They felt like a map. I started to notice other things too. Sounds, mostly. Soft creaks that didn't match the rhythm of my steps, whispers in a tone just below hearing, a distant shuffling when the house was supposed to be still. And then there was the light. Late one evening, as I sat in the living room trying to focus on a book, I noticed a faint glow seeping through the floorboards. It pulsed, faint and golden, casting strange shadows along the walls. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a trick of my tired mind, but I found myself standing, moving toward it. The glow was strongest near the door to the basement. I hadn't opened it since I moved in, partly out of respect for the landlord's warning, mostly because I didn't want to. But now, standing there, I felt the weight of the house pressing down on me, urging me to turn the knob. The door opened with a groan, revealing a staircase shrouded in shadows. The light came from below, weak but steady, painting the edges of the steps with flickering gold. The air smelled of earth and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. I descended. The basement was larger than I expected, its walls made of uneven stone. The light pooled at the far end, where the floor sloped downward into a narrow passage. There, on the floor, were the handprints. They formed a trail, leading into the passage. I wanted to turn back, but something in the light pulled at me, a silent invitation that felt like a demand. The passage narrowed as I moved deeper, the walls damp and cold against my shoulders. The pulsing grew stronger, a rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of my heart. Then I saw it. The room at the end of the passage was small, circular, its walls carved with the same symbols from my dream. In the center of the room stood a well, its edges crumbling, the stones dark with moisture. The golden light seeped up from the depths, casting ripples along the ceiling. I approached the well, my legs trembling. The light pulsed, brighter now, almost urgent. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, rising from the well. It wasn't speaking words, not exactly, but I understood it all the same. It was calling my name. I leaned over the edge, peering into the depths. The light flared, blinding, and for a moment I saw something. Something vast and shifting, its shape too fluid to hold, its eyes gleaming like molten gold. I stumbled back, the voice growing louder, sharper. The symbols on the walls glowed now, their lines twisting, unraveling. I ran. The passage seemed longer on the way back, the walls pressing closer, the pulsing chasing me like a heartbeat out of sync with my own. When I burst into the living room, the glow had disappeared, the house silent. But the handprints were everywhere now. On the ceiling, the windows, even the floor beneath my feet. They didn't form a map anymore. They formed a circle. I don't sleep anymore. Not really. The pulsing is still there, faint but constant, like a second heartbeat buried under my own. The light flickers sometimes, seeping through the cracks in the floorboards. And at night, when the house is at its quietest, I hear the voice. It's waiting for me to come back. The cabin wasn't supposed to exist. Not on the maps, not in the old hiking guides, and definitely not at the edge of the marked trail I'd been following for years. And yet, there it was. I was out for a solo hike in the hills behind my town, the kind of hike I'd done a dozen times. The route was predictable, winding through the woods and eventually looping back to the parking lot. But on this day, the weather was strange. Overcast but not quite stormy, the air unnervingly still, like it was holding its breath. As I walked, the trees seemed denser, the path narrower. I figured I'd taken a wrong turn at some point, though I couldn't remember seeing any forks. That's when I saw the clearing. And in the clearing, the cabin. It was old, sagging under the weight of time. Its roof covered in moss and shingles curling at the edges. The windows were dark, the glass cracked in places, and the front door hung slightly ajar, swinging faintly in a breeze I couldn't feel. A rusted wind chime dangled from the porch, though it didn't make a sound. I hesitated, scanning the area for signs of life. No car tracks, no footsteps, no smoke curling from the chimney. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt inhabited, like it was watching me as much as I was watching it. I should have walked away, turned around, retraced my steps, but curiosity gnawed at me. I told myself it wouldn't hurt to take a quick look, to poke around the outside and maybe snap a picture or two. I crossed the clearing cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. The closer I got, the worse it smelled. A cloying, metallic scent, like wet rust or old blood. Flies buzzed lazily around the porch, and I noticed dark stains on the wooden steps. My stomach churned, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. Something about the cabin was magnetic, pulling me forward despite every instinct screaming at me to leave. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under my weight, and the wind chime let out a single, discordant note. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the creak of the hinges. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the cracked windows. Dust motes floated in the air, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of grime. The first thing I noticed was the table. It sat in the center of the room, a crude wooden thing with uneven legs. On top of it was a collection of objects that made my skin crawl. A broken pocket watch, a single leather glove, a child's shoe, and a jar filled with murky liquid. The jar had something inside. Something small, pale, and vaguely organic, though I couldn't tell what. The walls were worse. They were covered in writing, words scratched deep into the wood, overlapping and chaotic. Some of it was in English, phrases like, "do not look" and "IT lies behind." But most of it was in a language I didn't recognize, sharp angular symbols that seemed to writhe when I stared at them too long. I backed away, my heart pounding, ready to leave. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as I stood frozen, straining to hear, it grew louder. A rhythmic, wet dragging noise coming from somewhere deeper inside the cabin. I turned to leave, but the door wasn't there. The frame was empty, leading not to the clearing but to a solid wall of trees. Thick, gnarled trunks pressed together tightly, their branches knitting into an impenetrable barrier. Panic surged through me, and I spun back toward the room. The dragging sound was closer now, accompanied by a faint scraping, like nails on wood. My eyes darted to the far corner, where a second door stood slightly ajar. Something moved in the shadows beyond it, something low to the ground, slithering closer with deliberate, unhurried movements. I grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a rusted fire poker leaning against the wall, and stumbled backward. The thing in the corner emerged, and my mind struggled to make sense of it. Its body was elongated, covered in a slick, grayish membrane that glistened in the dim light. Its face, if you could call it that, was featureless, save for a wide, lipless mouth that stretched impossibly far, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. It didn't rush me. It just tilted its head, as if studying me, and let out a sound that was almost a laugh, a wet, guttural chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. I swung the poker wildly as it advanced, the metal whistling through the air. The thing was fast, faster than it should have been, darting to the side and circling me like a predator toying with its prey. My back hit the table, the objects on top clattering to the floor. The jar shattered, and the thing inside it, a tiny, malformed hand, twitched and writhed before going still. The creature lunged, its mouth widening to an impossible size, and I did the only thing I could think of. I threw myself backward, hitting the wall hard enough to rattle my teeth. The force dislodged a loose panel, revealing a hidden crawl space. Without thinking, I scrambled inside, pulling the panel shut behind me just as the creature slammed against it. The space was cramped, the air thick with dust and decay. I could hear the thing outside, its claws scraping against the wood, its laughter echoing faintly. I crawled forward, my knees and palms scraping against the rough floor, until I reached the other end. There was a hatch, rusted and barely hanging on its hinges, but it opened. I tumbled out into the clearing, gasping for air. The cabin loomed behind me, dark and silent, its door hanging open like a gaping maw. I didn't stop to look back. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that tore at my skin and the roots that threatened to trip me. The forest seemed endless, but eventually, the trees thinned, and I stumbled onto the familiar path. When I reached my car, the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. The cabin was gone. The clearing, too. Just an unbroken line of trees where it had been. I don't hike anymore. Sometimes, at night, I dream of that cabin, of the things inside it. And when I wake, I swear I can hear that laughter, faint and wet, echoing in the dark. I was unpacking groceries when I noticed the message on the receipt. It wasn't handwritten or scribbled in marker. The words were printed neatly, as though they'd come straight from the store's register. Leave the eggs outside. At first, I thought it was some kind of promotion or joke, but there was no store logo, no cheerful slogan about savings or loyalty points. Just those words at the bottom of an otherwise normal receipt. I turned it over, expecting some explanation, but the back was blank. I laughed it off and tossed the receipt in the trash. The eggs stayed in the fridge. That night, I woke up to a sound in the kitchen. It wasn't loud, just a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, convincing myself it was the pipes or the wind. But the sound didn't stop. When I finally got up and crept into the kitchen, the tapping ceased. Everything was as I'd left it. The empty grocery bags on the counter, the light above the sink casting its usual pale glow. But the fridge door was slightly ajar. The eggs were gone. I searched every inch of the apartment, half expecting to find them smashed on the floor or sitting in some absurd place like the bathtub. But they weren't anywhere. The fridge hummed quietly as I stood in front of it, the cool air brushing against my face. I told myself I must have forgotten them at the store. The next day, Another message came, but this time it wasn't on a receipt. It was on my bathroom mirror, written in the steam after my shower. "You ignored us." My stomach twisted. The words began to fade as the steam dissipated, but I could still see faint traces of the letters, etched into the glass like scratches. That evening, as the sun set, I heard footsteps outside my apartment door. Not hurried or heavy, but deliberate, each one perfectly spaced. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see my neighbor or maybe a delivery person. The hallway was empty, but the sound didn't stop. It wasn't footsteps anymore. It was something softer, like bare skin dragging lightly across the doorframe. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. Whatever it was, it didn't knock. It didn't try to come in. It just stayed there, brushing against the door until I couldn't take it anymore. I spent that night in the bathroom with the door locked, the mirror turned to face the wall. The next morning, the eggs were back. They were sitting on the counter in a neat row, the carton nowhere to be found. But they weren't the same eggs I'd bought. Their shells were darker, almost glossy, with faint veins running across their surfaces like cracks in old porcelain. I didn't touch them. Another message arrived that afternoon. This time, it was inside my closet, scrawled on the back of a shirt I hadn't worn in months. "You took something that wasn't yours." I stood there, the shirt hanging limply from my hands, trying to piece together what it meant. The words didn't make sense, but the tone did. They were angry. By the time night fell, the eggs had moved again. Now they were on the windowsill, lined up like soldiers on parade. I couldn't stop looking at them, the way their veins pulsed faintly in the dim light, as though something inside was alive. I thought about smashing them, but the idea made my chest tighten, as if the air itself was pressing against me. Instead, I left them where they were and locked myself in the bedroom. Around midnight, I heard something crack. It wasn't loud, just a faint popping sound, like a joint being pulled out of place. Then came the tapping. It wasn't coming from the kitchen this time. It was coming from the window. My apartment is on the 4th floor. I stayed in bed, staring at the door, trying to will myself into believing it wasn't real. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like claws scraping against the glass. When I finally worked up the nerve to check, the window was empty. But the eggs were gone again. For the next few days, the messages grew more frequent. I found them everywhere, on the condensation inside a water glass, in the dust on my bookshelf, even carved into the soap in my bathroom. Each one was sharper, angrier, more accusatory. "You were warned. It's too late now. They're coming." I stopped leaving my apartment. It didn't matter. They came anyway. The first one appeared in the corner of my living room, just standing there. It wasn't human, though it was trying to be. Its arms were too long, its head tilted too far to the side, its skin faintly reflective like the eggshells. I didn't move. Neither did it. When I blinked, it was closer. By the time I managed to scramble into the bathroom and lock the door, it was standing just outside. I could hear it breathing. Slow, deep, deliberate. That's where I am now, writing this on my phone. The mirror's fogged up again, and there's another message forming, the letters appearing one by one as though etched by an invisible hand. "Open the door." The tapping has started again, but this time, it's coming from inside. I never liked staying in hotels. The air always felt too stale, as though it had been breathed in and out by 1,000 strangers before me. This particular one, tucked off a lonely stretch of highway, was no exception. Its sign, flickering neon blue, simply read, "Rest. Stop." 2 words, a promise and a warning. But it was late, and the rain had reduced visibility to nearly nothing. I didn't have a choice. The woman at the front desk didn't look up when I walked in. Her name tag read Callie, and her hair was piled on top of her head in a way that seemed too precise for the hour. She handed me the key to room 313 without a word, her chipped nails brushing against mine for just a moment. Her fingers were ice cold. The room itself was unremarkable. Beige walls, a bed that seemed too big for the space, and a single lamp on the nightstand. The window overlooked the highway, its curtains thick and heavy, as if designed to block out more than just the morning sun. It was quiet, too quiet. I unpacked slowly, my movements deliberate, trying to shake the sense that something was watching me. The mirror above the desk reflected the bed, the lamp, and the edge of the bathroom door. My own reflection, however, seemed oddly delayed, like it was lagging behind, just slightly. I turned to check the mirror directly, but when I faced it, everything seemed fine. The clock on the nightstand blinked 12:03 in red, steady numbers. I hadn't noticed it before. Something about it unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. I lay down, pulling the blanket over me, and listened to the rain tap against the window. The quiet was too loud, pressing against my ears like static. Somewhere outside, a car drove past, its headlights slicing through the curtains for just a moment. That was when I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't the shape of a tree, nor the streak of passing light. It was a figure, tall and slender, standing perfectly still in the far corner of the room. I sat up sharply, my breath caught in my chest, but the figure was gone. The corner was empty, the curtains drawn tightly shut. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, that my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the image. It had been there. When I woke up, though I don't remember falling asleep, it was 12:03 again. The clock hadn't changed, its glowing numbers burning into the darkness like an accusation. I glanced at the mirror. Something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it wasn't my reflection. The mirror rippled, the glass shifting like water, and I realized with a sharp jolt that the room reflected in the mirror wasn't mine. The bed was wrong, too narrow, the sheets crisp and white where mine were gray and tangled. The lamp was gone. The window was bare, its curtains missing, and in the mirror's room, there was someone sitting on the bed. It wasn't me. I stood, my legs trembling beneath me, and walked toward the mirror. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself were thickening around me. The figure on the bed remained motionless, its head tilted slightly downward as though studying something in its hands. I stopped a foot away, close enough to see the details. It was a man. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken and ringed with shadows. He wore a suit, the kind that might have been sharp decades ago but was now fraying at the seams. His hands cradled something small and dark, turning it over slowly. A key. The key to room 313. I wanted to run, to shatter the mirror, to do anything but stand there frozen, but my body refused to obey. The man looked up suddenly, his head snapping toward me so quickly it made me flinch. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt something cold and sharp crawl up my spine. He smiled. I stumbled backward, breaking my gaze, and when I looked again, the mirror reflected only my room, my bed, my lamp, my tangled sheets. But the clock was gone. I grabbed my bag, my keys, my jacket, anything I could carry, and ran. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the sound of rain muffled against the thick carpet. I reached the elevator and slammed the button for the lobby, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When the doors opened, I expected relief. Instead, I was greeted by the same hallway, stretching endlessly in both directions. The air was colder now, heavier. A faint sound drifted toward me, growing louder with each second. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, echoing against the silence. I pressed the elevator button again, but the doors wouldn't close. The footsteps stopped. I turned, and there he was, the man from the mirror, standing at the end of the hallway. His suit was darker now, wet as though he'd walked through the rain to reach me. His hands were empty, but I knew where the key was. I ran. Room 313 was the only door I recognized, the numbers etched into the wood like a scar. I flung it open, slamming it shut behind me, and pressed my back against it. My chest heaved, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was empty. The bed was made. The mirror was gone. And on the nightstand sat the key. I don't remember leaving the hotel. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, the rain still falling, the neon sign flickering in my rearview mirror. Rest. Stop. It's been 3 days since I left. The key is still in my pocket. I never intended to buy the painting. It was an impulse decision, born from boredom and too much time spent wandering the aisles of a thrift store on a dreary Saturday afternoon. The painting wasn't even remarkable, just a dreary, muted depiction of an old stone house on a hill, surrounded by leafless trees. The sky overhead was an ominous swirl of gray and black, and the house's windows were blank, as if painted shut. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to see in the background of a horror movie, but something about it caught my eye. Maybe it was the way the brushstrokes seemed too vivid, too alive, as if they'd been carved into the canvas rather than painted. Or maybe it was the faint, almost imperceptible feeling that the painting was looking back at me. I bought it for $10 and took it home, intending to hang it in my hallway as a joke. A little piece of kitschy creepiness to make guests uncomfortable. When I hung it on the wall, though, it didn't look like a joke. It looked wrong. Not in a way I could articulate, but in the way it dominated the space. The light in the hallway seemed dimmer with the painting there, and the colors of the house, those lifeless grays and blacks, seemed to bleed into the walls around it. That first night, I dreamed of the house. In the dream, I was standing at the bottom of the hill, staring up at the stone facade. The windows weren't blank anymore. They were filled with light, yellow and flickering, as if from candles. The trees on the hill swayed, though there was no wind. Something in the house moved, a shadow shifting behind the curtains. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My bedroom door was closed, as always, but the faintest scent of something earthy lingered in the air. Damp soil, decaying leaves. I didn't think about the dream until the next night, when it happened again. This time, I was closer to the house, standing on the cracked stone steps that led to the front door. The light from the windows flickered faster, more erratically, and I could hear something faint, a low, rhythmic hum, like distant chanting. When I woke, the scent was stronger. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to coincidence or stress, but over the next week, the dreams became more vivid, more insistent. Each night, I got closer to the house. By the sixth night, I was inside, standing in a dark, narrow hallway lined with doors. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the air smelled of mildew and candle wax. The chanting was louder now, though I still couldn't make out the words. It echoed through the house, coming from somewhere deep within. I told myself it was just a dream, a recurring nightmare, stress. But during the day, I began noticing strange things. The painting had changed. At first, it was subtle. The brushstrokes seemed sharper, the shadows deeper. The trees on the hill leaned closer to the house, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The windows, once blank, now glimmered faintly with a yellowish hue. I convinced myself I was imagining it. But then the painting changed again. The house wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood in one of the windows, a dark silhouette, featureless and still. That night, I dreamed of the hallway again. But this time, one of the doors was open. I don't remember walking toward it. I just remember standing in the doorway, staring into a room lit by dozens of candles. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crammed with jars filled with murky liquid. Floating inside the jars were strange shapes, bone fragments, tufts of hair, small animal skulls. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was the painting. It wasn't like the version on my wall. The canvas was darker, the colors more vivid, as if it were alive. The figure in the window wasn't a silhouette anymore. It had a face, hollow eyes, a slack jaw, skin that seemed too tight. It looked like me. I woke up screaming. The next morning, I tried to get rid of the painting. I took it off the wall, shoved it into a garbage bag, and drove to the dump. I hurled it into the landfill, watched it disappear into the sea of trash, and drove home, shaking. When I walked into my apartment, the painting was back on the wall. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, things in my apartment began to shift. Shadows lingered in the corners, even when the lights were on. The air grew colder, and the scent of damp earth and candle wax became impossible to ignore. I started hearing faint whispers, too soft to make out, but constant, like a distant conversation just beyond my hearing. And the painting kept changing. The figure in the window wasn't alone anymore. More shadows appeared, crowding the windows, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The trees on the hill grew darker, their branches clawing at the house. I stopped dreaming. Or maybe I just stopped remembering. The last time the painting changed, it was empty. The house was dark, The windows blank again. No trees, no shadows. Just the door, wide open, and the faint outline of stairs leading down into blackness. That night, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Slow, deliberate, growing louder with each step. When they stopped, the door creaked open. I didn't look. I couldn't. But I felt it. The cold, damp air, the presence standing in the doorway, watching. The last thing I remember is the sound of the painting falling to the floor, its frame splintering as it hit the ground. When I woke up, the painting was gone. But the house was still there, etched into the back of my eyelids every time I closed them, and the whispers hadn't stopped. I think they're waiting for me to come back. I've always trusted my memories. That might sound obvious. Who doesn't? But I mean really trusted them. I'm the kind of person who remembers exactly where I parked my car, what I ate 3 Thursdays ago, and every small, insignificant detail of every conversation. My mind has always been my anchor, my map, until it wasn't. It began. Not that I'd call it a beginning, with a word. A name, to be precise, Marlin House. I found it in my notes app, wedged between a grocery list and a half-finished reminder to call my dentist. It wasn't in my handwriting. The letters were jagged, almost panicked, as though they'd been scrawled in haste. I had no idea where it came from. I stared at it for a while, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Then I closed the app and didn't think about it again. The next day, I saw it again, this time on a scrap of paper tucked into my wallet. The handwriting was the same, sharp and urgent, but I knew I hadn't written it. The edges of the paper were singed, the faint scent of smoke clinging to it. I don't smoke. I threw it away and told myself to stop being paranoid. The name followed me after that. It appeared on the margins of a notepad at work, scratched faintly into the wood of my kitchen table, and even scribbled in soap on my bathroom mirror. I began to feel as though it had always been there, lurking just outside my awareness, waiting for the right moment to announce itself. Marlin House. I Googled it, of course. I searched for it everywhere, on maps, on obscure forums, even in my city's library archives. Nothing came up, not a single mention. And yet, the name clung to me, coiling tighter around my thoughts until it was all I could think about. One night, I woke to find my TV on, though I never use it. The screen glowed with static, the sound muted. I reached for the remote to turn it off, but the second my hand touched the buttons, the static shifted. It wasn't random anymore. Shapes flickered in the snow. Buildings, windows, the faint outline of a porch. And then there it was. A house. It was impossible to make out the details, but the structure loomed on the screen, its edges sharp against the shifting gray. I couldn't see a number or a sign, but somehow, I knew. Marlin House. The remote slipped from my hand. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke, the TV was off, the room dark and still. The next morning, I received a package on my doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Inside was a single key, tarnished and cold, attached to a tag with a name written on it. You can guess what it said. I should have ignored it. I should have thrown the key away and gone about my life. But it was too late for that. I was already caught in the gravity of it, my mind spiraling around the name like it was the center of some vast, invisible web. The key didn't fit anything in my apartment. I tried it on the front door, the back door, even the lock on my old bike. Nothing. It was as though the key was waiting for something, waiting for me. 2 days later, I found it. Or rather, it found me. I was driving home from work when I noticed a turnoff I'd never seen before. A narrow road wound through the trees, the pavement cracked and overgrown. I couldn't explain why I took it, only that it felt inevitable. The road twisted and narrowed until the trees swallowed it completely, the canopy overhead blotting out the sun. And then there it was. Marlin House. It wasn't grand or imposing. It was a modest, 2-story home, its shutters sagging and its porch half collapsed. But there was something off about it. The angles were too sharp, the shadows too deep, as though the house had been carved from the air itself. I parked my car and stepped out, the key cold and heavy in my pocket. The air around the house was silent, not the peaceful quiet of the woods, but an oppressive stillness that pressed against my skin. My footsteps crunched on the gravel path, though the sound seemed to fade too quickly, as if the house were swallowing it. The door opened before I reached it. Inside, the air was stale and thick, heavy with the scent of earth and rot. The walls were bare, the furniture covered in sheets that sagged under years of dust. The only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards as I moved through the rooms. And then I saw it. A mirror hung on the wall at the end of the hall. It was oval, its frame ornate and cracked, like something pulled from an old photograph. But it wasn't the mirror itself that stopped me. It was what I saw inside it. My reflection was wrong. It moved when I did, but the timing was off, like a delay in a bad video call. Its eyes followed mine, but there was something in them I didn't recognize, something hollow and hungry. And then it spoke, not out loud, but inside my head. "Welcome home." The words echoed through my mind, reverberating against my thoughts like a bell. My reflection didn't smile. It didn't blink. It just stood there, waiting. I don't remember running back to my car, but somehow, I made it. The house didn't follow me. It didn't need to. The next day, I found another note, tucked under my pillow. "You can't leave. Find the mirror." I opened the door. The handwriting was mine. "Marlin House hasn't let me go. I see it now, everywhere. In the shadows of my apartment, in the reflection of storefront windows, in the static of my TV. And the mirror? I can feel it watching. It's waiting for me to look again." It was a single shoe that began to unravel everything. Not an elegant heel or a polished loafer, but a scuffed, white sneaker with mismatched laces. I found it in the trunk of his car while looking for the jumper cables. It lay there alone, slightly damp and faintly muddy, as if it had been discarded in a hurry. "What's this?" I asked when he came out of the house, brushing crumbs off his shirt. I held the shoe up like evidence in a trial. He squinted at it, his mouth twitching into a confused smile. "No idea. Maybe it's old? Probably been there for ages." But it hadn't. His car was practically a showroom, vacuumed weekly, wiped down with lemon-scented wipes. He treated it better than our couch. I could have argued, could have pressed, but I didn't. I put the shoe back and closed the trunk, though the image of it lingered in my mind like an itch I couldn't reach. 2 days later, while cleaning out the laundry basket, I found a receipt. It was tucked into the pocket of his jeans, folded so neatly it felt deliberate. The name on the receipt wasn't his. Chloe. It was for 2 coffees and a lemon tart from a cafe we'd never been to. I stared at the receipt for a long time, trying to will it into making sense. When I finally asked him about it, I tried to keep my voice light. "Who's Chloe?" He looked up from his laptop, his face blank for a moment before softening into confusion. "Chloe? Oh, must be a mistake. Maybe they mixed up the names on the receipt." He chuckled, the sound forced. "Weird, right?" I nodded, but the doubt settled deep. It wasn't just the shoe or the receipt. It was the way he laughed too hard at his own explanation, the way his eyes flickered to the side, as if checking for an escape. Over the next few weeks, the peculiarities stacked up like a teetering tower. He started using words he'd never used before, phrases that felt foreign in his mouth. "That slaps," he said one evening, describing a song he'd played at least a dozen times without comment. The words felt borrowed, a language that didn't belong to us. And then there was the way he moved. His routine was still the same. Coffee at 7, work at 8, gym on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But there was a new energy to it, like he was living 2 lives. He started coming home later, blaming traffic or a last-minute meeting. Once, I asked why his shirt smelled like lavender when his office always reeked of stale coffee and printer ink. "New air freshener," he'd said, waving it off. It wasn't until the night of the blackout that everything came into focus. The storm had knocked out the power just after sunset, plunging the house into a flickering, candlelit quiet. He sat on the couch, scrolling on his phone, while I tried to make sense of the static on the radio. "Don't use up all your battery," I said absently. He didn't answer. The light from his phone cast strange shadows on his face, and I realized he was smiling. Not a casual grin, but something deeper, more intimate. The kind of smile reserved for private jokes and whispered secrets. "What's funny?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked up, startled, and quickly turned the screen off. "Oh, nothing." Just a meme. You wouldn't get it." His dismissiveness stung more than I wanted to admit. I turned back to the radio, but my ears stayed tuned to the sound of his typing, rapid and deliberate. Later that night, when he went to bed, he left his phone on the counter. It buzzed once, a message from someone named C. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I shouldn't. I knew I shouldn't. But before I could stop myself, I swiped it open. The thread was short but unmistakable. "C, I can't wait to see you again." Him, "Me too. You looked amazing today." I felt the world tilt under my feet. The next morning, I didn't mention the messages. Instead, I waited. I watched. A week later, I followed him. He left the house in his gym clothes, but didn't head toward the fitness center. Instead, he drove to the cafe from the receipt. I parked across the street, my pulse racing, and watched him go inside. A few minutes later, a woman joined him, a petite brunette with a bright yellow raincoat. She laughed as she sat down, and he leaned in, his hand grazing hers on the table. I didn't confront them. I sat in my car, frozen, watching their silhouettes through the glass. When he came home that night, I was waiting for him. I placed the receipt, the shoe, and a printout of the messages on the table. "What's this?" he asked, his voice tight. "You tell me," I said. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what it looks like." "It looks like you're seeing someone else," I said, my voice steady. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said finally. I wanted to scream, to throw the shoe at him, to demand answers. But instead, I just stared at him, the man I thought I knew, and felt a strange sense of calm. "I think you should go," I said quietly. He didn't argue. He packed a bag that night and left without looking back. In the months that followed, I found myself piecing together the life I thought we had, examining it from every angle. The shoe, the receipt, the messages, they were just fragments of a larger picture, one that no longer needed solving. Sometimes, when I pass that cafe, I think about going in. I wonder if he's still meeting her there, if the laughter I hear through the glass belongs to them. But I never stop. The road ahead feels too open, too full of possibility, to waste on what's already behind me. The clock on the mantel was ticking backwards. Eliza noticed it as soon as she entered the house, though she didn't mention it to her father. He was busy anyway, fussing over the loose floorboards in the hallway. "Old houses are like old dogs," he'd said when they moved in, loyal but stubborn. She'd nodded politely, not pointing out that loyalty wasn't something you could measure in wood and nails. The clock had been there when they arrived, an ornate thing with curling brass hands and numbers that glimmered faintly, as though caught between eras. Its face was pale, cracked porcelain, and the case was dark oak polished to a deceptive shine. She hadn't noticed the movement at first. It was only later, as she sat at the window watching the rain smear the landscape into watercolors, that she saw the hands inching counterclockwise, minute by minute, like a deliberate undoing. Her father didn't care much for clocks, and she knew better than to mention it. He'd blame her imagination, like he always did. "You see stories where there aren't any," he'd said once, after she insisted the sound in the attic was something alive. So she left the clock alone, its quiet rebellion ticking away in the background, and went about unpacking her room. That night, the house refused to sleep. The wind tangled itself in the eaves, howling as if searching for something, and the walls creaked in protest. The faint sound of dripping water came from somewhere, though Eliza couldn't tell where. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the first shift came. It wasn't loud, more like the absence of sound, the way a room changes when a door closes somewhere far away. The air felt thicker, denser, as though she'd been submerged in something invisible. She sat up, her pulse quickening, and listened. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then she heard it, footsteps, soft but deliberate, crossing the floor downstairs. She slid out of bed, her feet brushing the cold wood, and crept to her door. Her father's room was silent, the faint outline of his shadow still visible through the gap beneath his door. The sound came again, closer this time. She thought about waking him but hesitated. If it was nothing, he'd only be annoyed. If it was something, Well, she wasn't sure she wanted him to find out. The hallway was colder than her room, the air biting at her skin. She moved slowly, her hand brushing the wall for balance, and peered over the banister. The house stretched out below her, dim and unmoving, except for the clock. Its ticking was louder now, sharp and urgent, like the chime of faraway bells. The hand spun faster than before, blurring into a motion she couldn't follow. Light flickered faintly from the edges of its face, not steady like a candle but erratic, almost alive. The footsteps stopped. "Eliza!" The voice was low, a whisper edged with familiarity. It didn't call again, but the sound lingered, curling around her like smoke. Her breath caught. She couldn't place the voice, but it felt familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten. She turned, searching the shadows for movement, but the hallway was empty. "Eliza!" It came again, quieter now, and she realized with a jolt that it wasn't coming from behind her. It was coming from the clock. She descended the stairs slowly, each step groaning beneath her weight. The clock stood in its place, humming faintly, its light spilling onto the floor in twisting patterns. She stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to approach. The air around it was thick, trembling with an energy that made her teeth ache. "Eliza!" This time, the voice wasn't a whisper. It was inside her head, clear and direct. "Do you remember?" "Remember what?" Her voice came out small, trembling, but the question felt heavier than the air between them. The clock's light pulsed, casting the room in stark shadows. "Everything you asked to forget?" She staggered back. Her memories felt distant, fragmented, like trying to recall a dream after waking. The voice pushed deeper, curling into her mind, pulling at corners she hadn't touched in years. "You left them here," it said, "locked away. But time does not hold still." The light surged, spilling beyond the clock, flooding the room with a brightness that burned against her eyelids. She raised her arms, shielding herself, as images burst into her mind. A woman's voice, sharp with worry. A child's laughter, muffled by distance. A house not this house, burning in the dark. And then the cold. It was sudden and absolute, a chill so deep it consumed her breath. The light dimmed, pulling itself back into the clock, and the house returned to its muted stillness. But the weight in her chest remained, pressing harder with each shallow breath. "Eliza!" The voice murmured one last time, softer now. "You cannot run from time." The clock stilled, its hands frozen mid-motion. The air settled, the house exhaling like a tired thing. She backed away, her knees weak, and stumbled into the hallway. She didn't look back. She couldn't. In the morning, her father found her sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the horizon. She didn't tell him about the clock or the voice or the memories it had pried loose. She didn't tell him about the fire or the name she still couldn't remember. She only looked at him, her voice flat, and said, "We need to leave." He frowned but didn't argue. He never understood her stories, but he'd learned not to fight them either. By afternoon, the house was empty again, its windows staring out at the world like blind eyes. The clock resumed ticking that night, slow and steady, counting backwards once more. The town was the kind of place you passed through without thinking twice. A few gas stations, a diner with a faded sign, and a single blinking traffic light that seemed almost apologetic for being there. I'd driven through it a dozen times on my way to the city, but this time, I stopped. My car sputtered and died just as I reached the outskirts, coasting to a reluctant stop in front of a convenience store with a crooked neon sign that read, "Dan's." Dan, it turned out, wasn't much for conversation. He had the kind of face that looked carved out of wood, hard lines and hollow eyes that didn't seem to focus on anything. "Nearest mechanic's 2 towns over," he said, sliding a pack of gum across the counter. "You'd best find a room for the night." I glanced at the single street running through the heart of town. "Is there a hotel?" Dan didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked up to meet mine, then back down to the counter. "Try the Holloway. End of the road, left-hand side. Should still have a room." The Holloway wasn't a hotel. It was an old house, 3 stories tall, with peeling white paint and sagging gutters. A vacancy, Sign hung in one window. Its letters faded to near invisibility. There was no receptionist, no front desk, just a handwritten note taped to the door. Rooms upstairs. Pick one. Pay in the morning. I almost left. The house looked like the kind of place that showed up in urban legends, a black and white photo that would pop up in some YouTube video about cursed places. But the night was cold, and I had nowhere else to go. The room I chose was small and unremarkable. A twin bed with a threadbare quilt, a wooden chair by the window, and a single light bulb hanging from a frayed cord in the ceiling. The only decoration was a mirror, oval and slightly warped, mounted above the dresser. The glass had a faint haze to it, like it had absorbed the years of neglect rather than reflecting them. I unpacked the basics and settled in, telling myself it was just one night. The bed creaked under my weight, the springs groaning like an old man's knees. I turned off the light and lay staring at the ceiling, the house settling into uneasy silence around me. I don't know what woke me, but I knew immediately something was wrong. The air in the room felt heavier, thick enough to choke on. I sat up, squinting into the darkness, and realized the faint glow in the corner of the room wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the mirror. The glass shimmered faintly, like water catching moonlight. I stood and approached it, heart thudding painfully against my ribs. The reflection it showed wasn't quite right. The dresser and bed were there, but the room looked subtly different, cleaner, brighter. And then I saw myself, or at least, I thought it was me. The figure in the mirror stood where I should have been, but its posture was off. It stood a little too straight, its head tilted slightly to one side as though listening. And it didn't blink. Not once. I raised a hand, testing the reflection, and the figure mimicked me perfectly. But the expression on its face was wrong, too neutral, too still. It watched me with the patience of a predator. I stepped back, nearly tripping over the chair. The reflection smiled. My reflection smiled. And then it raised a hand, not mirroring me this time, but moving on its own. I grabbed my bag and fled, my footsteps pounding down the stairs. The house groaned around me, the walls shuddering as though they might collapse. I hit the front door running, the night air biting against my skin as I stumbled onto the porch. Dan was waiting in his truck, parked at the curb. His window rolled down, and he motioned for me to get in without a word. I didn't question it. He didn't speak until we were halfway back to the convenience store. "Saw the light," he said finally, his voice low. "Knew you wouldn't last the night." "What the hell was that?" I demanded. My hands were shaking, gripping the dashboard like it might ground me in reality. Dan glanced at me, his face as unreadable as before. "The Holloway's been here longer than the town," he said. "Longer than anyone can remember. People go in, but the ones who stay don't come out the same. You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, swallowing hard. It was me, but not. Dan didn't answer. He just drove, the headlights carving a narrow path through the endless dark. I didn't sleep that night, not even after Dan dropped me off at a nearby motel. In the morning, I found my car running perfectly fine, as though nothing had ever been wrong with it. But when I drove past the end of the road where the Holloway should have been, there was nothing there. No house, no vacancy sign, just an empty lot overgrown with weeds. I haven't gone back to that town since, but sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of my reflection in a dark window or a still puddle, and for just a moment, it doesn't feel like mine. It watches me too closely, its movements just a hair too slow, and it's always smiling. I moved into the apartment because it felt like a second chance. The kind of place you find after too many restless nights, too many hours convincing yourself you're fine when you know you're not. It was small, but the light was good. Big windows that faced the sunrise and a balcony barely big enough for a chair and a coffee mug. The walls were freshly painted, the carpets new, and for once, I felt like I was stepping into something untouched, something entirely mine. The day I moved in, I noticed the door across the hall. It was unremarkable, its beige paint identical to mine, but the number, 302, was missing a screw, the brass plate dangling slightly askew. I didn't think much of it at first. The building was old. Things like that happened. As the weeks went by, I didn't see anyone come or go from that apartment. It wasn't unusual. People kept to themselves here, passing like shadows in the hallways. The only indication that someone lived there was the faint sound of music, always low and muffled, seeping through the door at odd hours. It wasn't annoying, just curious. Classical, maybe? Strings and a piano, soft and melancholy. One evening, I found an envelope slipped under my door. It was plain, no markings except for my name written in neat, blocky handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper. Welcome to the building. If you need anything, knock on 302. The thought was kind, even if the delivery was strange. I hadn't even met my neighbor. The note made me feel guilty for not introducing myself, so the next morning, I decided to fix that. I knocked on the door of 302, balancing a plate of cookies I'd picked up at the bakery. There was no answer. I knocked again, waiting longer this time, but the music on the other side never faltered. After a moment, I placed the plate on the floor and left, feeling awkward and slightly foolish. The cookies were gone when I got home that evening, but no one came to thank me. That night, I dreamed of the music. It wasn't the soft, soothing kind I'd heard before. It was sharper, frantic, like someone pressing the wrong keys over and over again. The notes jangled and twisted, and beneath them, I could hear something else, a voice, low and garbled, saying words I couldn't quite make out. I woke to the sound of knocking, 3 sharp raps, echoing through the stillness of my bedroom. I sat up, heart pounding, and waited for it to come again. It didn't. When I checked the hallway, the door to 302 was shut, the space quiet except for the faint hum of the building. The next day, I asked the building manager about my neighbor. He gave me a long, puzzled look. "No one's in 302, he said. "That unit's been empty for months." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his expression didn't change. "What about the music?" I asked. "I hear it all the time." He shrugged. "Could be the pipes. These walls aren't exactly soundproof." That answer didn't sit right with me. I knew what I'd heard. I'd seen the cookies disappear. I even had the note to prove it. Still, I told myself to let it go. Maybe I'd gotten the wrong apartment number, or maybe the manager didn't know everything that went on in the building. I went back to my routine, pretending not to notice the music or the way the door to 302 always seemed to shift slightly, as if someone had just been there. One night, the music stopped. I didn't realize how accustomed I'd grown to it until the silence pressed against me, thick and unnatural. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when the knocking came again. This time, it wasn't at my door. It was at the wall. 3 knocks, deliberate and steady, right by my head. I sat up, heart hammering, and stared at the wall. The knocking came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. Slowly, I pressed my ear to the plaster, holding my breath. A voice whispered on the other side, "Let me out." I jerked back, every instinct screaming to leave, but I couldn't move. My body felt rooted, anchored by something I couldn't name. The voice came again, closer now, as if it were speaking through the wall itself. "Let me out," it said, more insistent this time. "Please." My mouth was dry, my hands trembling. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. There was a pause, long enough to make me wonder if I'd imagined it all. Then, the voice spoke again. "You invited me." The words hit me like ice. I didn't know what they meant, but the certainty in them terrified me. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed the building manager. He didn't answer. I called again and again, until finally the line connected. 302, I said, my voice shaking. "Something's happening in 302. There was a pause, then a long sigh. "I told you, that unit's empty." "No," I said louder now. "It's not. Someone's in there. Something is in the walls." The line went dead. When I turned back to the wall, the music had started again. Not the soft strings I'd grown used to, but the frantic, disjointed notes from my dream. And the voice was still there, whispering through the sound. "You invited me." I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. By morning, I'd packed a bag and driven halfway across the city to a motel. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew I couldn't stay. The building manager called me a week later. "Your lease is still active," he said. "Are you planning to come back?" "No," I told him. I can't. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, quietly, he said, I wouldn't either. I hung up and blocked the number. I don't know what was in 302 or how I'd invited it, but sometimes I still hear the music in my dreams. And when I wake up, I think I can hear it faintly, just outside the door, waiting. The last tenant left the toolbox behind. It was wedged under the kitchen sink when I moved into the house, a rusted old thing with dents along the edges and a handle wrapped in fraying electrical tape. I almost threw it out, but figured it might come in handy. I was still unpacking, after all, and new houses always came with little fixes to make. The first time I opened it, I found what you'd expect: screwdrivers, wrenches, pliers, and a scattering of mismatched screws at the bottom. There was something strange, though: a roll of black electrical tape with the word "keep" scrawled across the side in what looked like permanent marker. I laughed at the dramatic labeling and tossed the toolbox into the laundry room, figuring I'd deal with it later. The strange thing was, it wasn't later. It was the same night. I woke to a loud clunk from the direction of the laundry room. Groggy and confused, I stumbled out of bed to investigate, but everything seemed fine. No leaks, no intruders, just the toolbox sitting exactly where I'd left it. I went back to bed, dismissing the noise as part of the natural settling sounds of an unfamiliar house. But the sounds didn't stop. Over the next few days, I started hearing faint metallic rattles, soft scraping noises, and occasionally the unmistakable snap of something falling. Every time I checked, the toolbox was closed, sitting in its corner like an obedient pet. I didn't open it again until the third night. That's when I found the note. It wasn't there before. I was certain of it. A small, square piece of paper had been wedged between the pliers and the roll of tape. It was old and yellowed, the edges fraying, but the writing on it was clear and sharp. If you hear it, don't ignore it. My first instinct was to laugh. It was so ominous, so ridiculously cryptic that I almost wanted to call the previous tenant and congratulate them on their dedication to scaring whoever moved in after them. But something about the note unsettled me. It wasn't just the words, it was the placement, the fact that it hadn't been there before, and the unmistakable feeling that I was being addressed. That night, the sounds intensified. It wasn't just clunks and rattles anymore. I started hearing faint murmurs, just barely audible through the walls, like someone talking on the other side, but too far away to make out the words. The noises came in bursts, as though they were trying to get my attention, and no matter how tightly I covered my ears, the sound still crept in. I slept with the lights on. The following morning, I decided to get rid of the toolbox. I carried it out to the curb, placing it next to the trash cans, and went back inside with a strange sense of relief. But later that day, when I went to grab my keys, I found the toolbox sitting on my kitchen counter. I stared at it for a long time, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. There was no way I could have brought it back inside without remembering. The weight of it alone would have made it impossible to miss. When I opened it this time, there was another note. It belongs here. I slammed the lid shut and threw the whole thing into the backyard, convinced now that someone was messing with me. Maybe the landlord had a key and thought it would be funny to play some weird prank. I even called to ask, but they sounded genuinely confused. A toolbox? No, the last tenant didn't leave anything behind. Are you sure it's not yours? That night, I dreamed about the tape. In the dream, I was in my laundry room, standing over the toolbox. The lid was open, and the roll of electrical tape was glowing faintly, as if it were alive. I reached for it, and as soon as my fingers touched the surface, the glow turned into something darker, pulsing shadows that crept out like smoke. The shadows wrapped around my hand, pulling me forward, and I woke up gasping. The toolbox was back in the laundry room. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened it immediately, my hands shaking. The tape was sitting there, innocent and ordinary, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Instead, I grabbed the pliers and started poking at it, trying to dislodge it from its spot. The tape wobbled but didn't move. And then it hummed. Not a sound exactly, but a vibration that traveled through the air, low and insistent. It filled the room, resonating in my chest like a deep bass note, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a basket of clothes. The hum stopped the moment I let go of the pliers. That night, The murmurs turned into voices. They were clearer now, less distant, and they were speaking directly to me. I couldn't understand the words. They were garbled, overlapping, like 100 voices trying to speak at once. But the tone was unmistakable, urgent, commanding. I lay in bed, paralyzed, as the shadows in the room seemed to shift and ripple with every whispered syllable. When the sun rose, I made my decision. I grabbed the toolbox and drove. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. I ended up at a junkyard on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled like rust and regret. I hurled the toolbox into a pile of scrap metal and left without looking back. For a moment, I thought it was over. When I got home, the toolbox wasn't waiting for me. No notes appeared, no whispers followed. I slept for the first time in days, thinking I'd finally escaped. But when I went to brush my teeth the next morning, the tape was there, sitting on the bathroom counter. It was no longer labeled "keep." The word had been replaced with something else, written in the same sharp scrawl. Yours. The job posting was simple. Caretaker needed for private estate. Quiet, remote, free lodging. Must be comfortable with solitude. The idea thrilled me. After years of chaos working in a crowded office, I longed for a slower pace. The pay was excellent, and the thought of spending a season surrounded by nature felt almost romantic. I didn't ask too many questions during the interview. They seemed satisfied with my references, and a week later, I was on a train heading to the estate. The journey took me deep into the countryside, where cell service disappeared and towns grew scarce. By the time the car they'd sent picked me up at the station, I was already half wondering if I'd made a mistake. The driver, a middle-aged man with a thick accent, was friendly but said little. He did, however, glance at me in the rearview mirror several times, as though he wanted to say something but thought better of it. The estate was larger than I'd imagined, a sprawling property surrounded by dense woods. The main house was beautiful but aged, its stone facade weathered by time. I was greeted by Mrs. Harlan, a housekeeper who was polite but brisk, as though eager to finish her duties and leave me to it. She gave me a quick tour, pointing out the basics: the kitchen, my living quarters in the guest wing, the library where most of the estate's records were kept. Then she handed me a set of keys. "I'll be back on Fridays to check in," she said. "Otherwise, you won't see anyone out here." Her tone was almost a warning. I asked about the owner of the estate. She hesitated, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. "Mr. Carver rarely visits," she said. "You likely won't see him." With that, she left, her car disappearing down the long gravel drive. The first few days passed peacefully. The house, though grand, was filled with signs of abandonment. Dust-covered furniture, clocks that had stopped ticking, the faint scent of mildew in the less-used rooms. My duties were straightforward: cataloging the records in the library, tending to the overgrown garden, and making sure the property remained in good condition. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I enjoyed the stillness. At night, the woods came alive with the sounds of owls and crickets, a lullaby of sorts that helped me sleep better than I had in years. But the peace didn't last. It began with the feeling that I wasn't alone, not in a dramatic, shadow-in-the-corner way, but in subtle moments. The sense of being watched while I worked, the faint impression of footsteps on the creaky floorboards overhead when I knew no one else was in the house. I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me. Old houses make noises. Solitude makes you hyper-aware. It was nothing. One night, while reading in the library, I came across a journal tucked between two ancient ledgers. Its leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. Inside, the handwriting was sharp and precise, its entries spanning decades. At first, it seemed to be the journal of the estate's original caretaker, a man named Elias, but the further I read, the stranger it became. The entries started with mundane observations, weather, maintenance tasks, notes about the grounds. But then they grew, unsettling. Mentions of the figure began appearing, always vague but dripping with unease. Saw it near the edge of the garden again. One entry read, "Watching, as always. I don't think it likes me here." Another said, "Woke to the sound of breathing outside my door. Locked it this time." The entries ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted. My pulse quickened as I closed the journal, my eyes darting toward the library's windows. They were dark, reflecting only the room behind me. But the unease lingered, a weight pressing down on my chest. That night, I dreamed of the woods. In the dream, I stood at the edge of the garden, staring into the trees. Something moved between the trunks, too fast to track. But the impression it left was wrong. Its silhouette elongated, its movements unnatural. When I woke, the air in my room was cold, and the window, which I was sure I'd closed, was slightly open. The following days blurred together, marked by small, inexplicable occurrences. Tools left in the garden vanished, only to reappear in places I hadn't been. The lights flickered at odd intervals, despite the estate having a recently updated generator. And always, there was the sense of being watched. One evening, while tending to the garden at dusk, I glanced toward the woods and saw it. A figure, tall and angular, standing perfectly still among the trees. It was too far to make out details, but its shape was wrong, the angles of its body sharper than they should have been. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and then, without moving, it vanished as though it had never been there at all. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was getting to me, but deep down, I knew better. The final straw came one night when I heard the piano in the main hall playing. The sound was soft, tentative, as though someone were testing the keys. I hadn't touched the piano since I'd arrived, and the idea of someone else being in the house filled me with dread. Gripping the heaviest flashlight I could find, I crept toward the main hall, my heart pounding. The music stopped the moment I stepped inside. The piano stood in the center of the room, its lid closed, its keys untouched. But on the bench sat an object, a pair of gloves. Old-fashioned, black, and unmistakably not mine. I left that night, throwing what I could into my bag and driving until the estate was miles behind me. I didn't care about the contract or the money. I didn't care that I'd abandoned my duties. Whatever was in that house, whatever watched from the woods, whatever played the piano, I didn't want to understand it. Months later, I looked up the estate online. Its history was fragmented, filled with gaps, but one detail stood out. The original caretaker, Elias, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His belongings were found in his room, untouched. The estate changed hands several times after that, each owner spending less and less time there. The current owner, Mr. Carver, no record of him existed. Sometimes, I dream of the house. In the dreams, I'm back in the library, reading the journal, but the entries have changed. They describe me, cataloging my movements, my thoughts. And always, they end the same way. It doesn't like her here. There's a smell in my apartment. It's subtle at first, like something faintly burnt or wet, clinging to the edges of the air. At first, I think it's the neighbors. The walls here are thin, and the guy next door burns incense so strong it makes my eyes water when he lights it. But this smell is different. It's sharp, chemical, and something else underneath. Something sweet and rotten. It doesn't stay in one place either. Some mornings, it's strongest in the kitchen, rising up from the sink like a warning. Other days, it's in the living room, clinging to the couch cushions. Yesterday, I smelled it in the closet, seeping out from between my coats like it had been hiding there, waiting for me to open the door. I've cleaned every inch of this apartment. I've scrubbed the floors, emptied the trash, pulled apart the fridge, and even dismantled the air vents to see if something was stuck in them. Nothing helps. The smell doesn't go away. When I call the building manager to complain, he sounds distracted, annoyed. Smells come and go, he says. Old building. Try baking soda. But baking soda doesn't stop whatever this is. The strange part is that it's not just the smell. Things are moving, too. Not big things, just enough to make me question myself. My coffee mug isn't on the counter where I left it, but in the bathroom sink. My shoes are lined up neatly by the front door one night. Even though I usually kick them off haphazardly, my keys go missing, only to turn up under the bed, arranged in a perfect circle. It feels personal, somehow, intentional. The other night, I woke up to a soft tapping sound. I lay there for a moment, heart racing, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't the window, it was inside. 3 soft taps, then silence. 3 more, then silence again. When I finally got up to investigate, the smell hit me like a wall. It was thick and choking, so overpowering that I had to cover my mouth and nose with my shirt. The air felt heavy, pressing against me as I stumbled from room to room, searching for the source. The tapping stopped when I reached the kitchen. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the microwave clock. Everything looked normal until I noticed the fridge door. It was slightly open, just enough for the light inside to spill out. I hesitated, my fingers tightening on the edge of the counter. The smell was stronger here, so strong that my eyes began to water. My hand shook as I reached for the handle and pulled. Inside, everything was wrong. The shelves were empty, but the walls of the fridge were lined with writing. Words and symbols, scratched deep into the plastic like someone had clawed them there. They didn't make sense. Not in any language I knew, but they thrummed with a kind of energy, an unsettling rhythm that made my vision blur if I stared too long. And there, in the middle of the fridge, was something I couldn't explain. It was a jar, old, cloudy glass, filled with something dark and sloshing. A faint glow pulsed from its contents, illuminating the scratches on the walls like they were alive. The lid was covered in the same symbols, etched deep enough to have broken through the metal. I didn't touch it. I slammed the fridge shut and backed away, my breathing loud and uneven in the silence. The smell was still there, wrapping around me, clinging to my skin. I turned on every light in the apartment and sat on the couch, shaking, until the sun came up. By morning, the fridge was empty again. No scratches, no jar, nothing to prove what I'd seen. But the smell was still there. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Stress, lack of sleep, something explainable. But the scratches weren't just in the fridge anymore. They started appearing on the walls. At first, they were faint, like someone had barely grazed the surface with a knife. Then they grew deeper, more deliberate. I found them in the bathroom mirror, circling the edges of my reflection. I found them under my bed, etched into the floorboards like they'd been there for decades. The symbols weren't random anymore. They were repeating, connecting, growing into something larger. And then there were the shadows. They didn't move like normal shadows, tied to light and angles. These seemed to ripple on their own, stretching and twisting across the walls even when nothing was casting them. I'd catch them out of the corner of my eye, dark smudges that disappeared the moment I turned to look directly at them. One night, I woke to find one standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was tall, too tall, its edges flickering like smoke, its head tilted unnaturally, as though it was trying to see me better. I couldn't make out a face, but I could feel its gaze pressing down on me, pinning me in place. The smell was suffocating now, thick and cloying, filling my throat with every breath. "I don't understand," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if it could hear me. The shadow didn't move, but the scratches on the walls did. They shimmered, rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. And then I realized they weren't symbols. They were instructions. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the apartment. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I drove for hours, not caring where I ended up, just needing to put distance between myself and whatever I'd awakened. I don't know if it's still there. I don't know if it's waiting for me to come back. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still smell it. I found the box in the attic the day I moved into the house. It wasn't hidden, not really, but it was the only thing in a space otherwise cleared out by the previous owners. The box was small, about the size of a shoebox, and wrapped in thick brown paper, the kind that looked too heavy to tear by accident. There was no writing on it, no address or label, just plain twine tied in a neat bow at the top. It felt heavy when I lifted it, heavier than it looked, and when I gave it a gentle shake, something inside shifted with a faint metallic rattle. I shouldn't have opened it. But people are curious, aren't they? That itch in the back of your mind, the one that says just look, even when every sensible part of you says to leave it alone. Inside was a hand mirror, the kind you'd expect to find on a Victorian dressing table. Its silver frame was tarnished, the handle decorated with delicate engravings of flowers and vines. But it was the glass itself that caught my attention. It wasn't like any mirror I'd ever seen. The surface wasn't reflective, Not entirely. Instead, it seemed to shimmer faintly, as though it held a film of water just beneath the surface. When I tilted it toward the light, the glass didn't just reflect. It moved, faint ripples spreading outward from its center. I told myself it was some kind of antique trick. Old glass does strange things. Metals warp and distort over time. I should have wrapped it back up and put it away, but I didn't. That night, I dreamed about the mirror. In the dream, I was holding it, standing in a dark room with no walls and no ceiling, just a vast, infinite blackness stretching in all directions. The mirror was cold in my hands, and when I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. I saw a door. It was old and wooden, its surface scarred by deep gouges as though someone, or something, had tried to claw their way through it. The handle was iron, and as I stared, the door began to creak open. I woke before I could see what was on the other side. The next morning, the mirror was on my bedside table. I know I didn't bring it there. I hadn't even touched it since I opened the box. It should have still been in the attic, tucked away with the twine and brown paper. I should have left the house that day, packed up my things, and never looked back. Instead, I started seeing things. It was subtle at first, just faint flickers of movement in the mirror's surface when I passed it. A shadow that lingered too long, the outline of something just out of frame. Once, I swore I saw a hand, pale and thin, pressing against the glass from the inside. But the worst part wasn't what I saw, it was how the mirror felt. Whenever I was near it, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. It was a quiet, insidious feeling, like someone watching you from across a crowded room. I moved the mirror to the attic, thinking that would solve the problem. It didn't. The dreams got worse. Every night, I stood in that same dark expanse, holding the mirror as the door in its surface loomed larger and larger. Each time, the door creaked open a little farther. Each time, I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and the sensation of cold fingers brushing the back of my neck. One night, I decided not to sleep. I made myself coffee and sat in the living room with the lights on, my laptop open to some mindless TV show. By 2 a.m., my eyelids were heavy, but I refused to let them close. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from above me, slow and deliberate, creaking across the attic floor. I froze. The house was old, the kind of place where every breeze made the wood groan. But these weren't the random sounds of a settling building. These were distinct, too heavy to be a mouse, too slow to be anything accidental. They stopped directly above where I was sitting. I don't know how long I stayed there, gripping my mug like it was a lifeline, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The house went silent again, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The next morning, the mirror was back. This time, it wasn't on my bedside table. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, propped upright against the backsplash like someone had placed it there to greet me. The glass shimmered faintly in the morning light, and as I stared into it, I felt that same unbearable sense of being watched. Only this time, I wasn't alone. Behind me, reflected in the mirror's surface, was the door. It was open now, wide enough for something to step through. And it did. I didn't see its full form. Not really. Just the suggestion of a shape, too tall and too thin, its edges blurring and shifting like smoke caught in a beam of light. It moved toward me in the reflection, and as I turned to look behind me, it was gone. The mirror fell from the counter, shattering on the floor. I stood there, staring at the shards of glass, expecting something to crawl out of them. But nothing happened. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of iron, but I was alone. I swept up the glass, wrapping each shard in layers of paper before throwing it in the trash. I told myself it was over. That night, I dreamed again. The dark expanse was gone, replaced by my own living room. The mirror hung above the fireplace, its surface rippling like water. And in the reflection, I saw myself, not standing, not moving, just lying on the floor, staring blankly at the ceiling. The reflection smiled. I haven't gone back to the house since, but sometimes, when I pass a reflective surface, I catch glimpses of something in the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, a hand pressed against the glass. When I received the email, I almost deleted it without reading. The subject line, urgent. Please confirm your existence. Sounded like phishing or some weird existential joke. It was from an address I didn't recognize, just a string of random letters and numbers. But something stopped me, some faint sense of unease that prickled at the edges of my mind. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a single line of text. Reply with your name if this is truly you. I stared at the screen for a long time, torn between curiosity and caution. Eventually, I typed a single word, Ryan. I hit send and forgot about it, telling myself it was nothing. By the next morning, I had a reply. Thank you, Ryan. We needed confirmation. That was it. No explanation, no follow-up. I rolled my eyes and closed the email, assuming it was some obscure marketing tactic. But throughout the day, the message lingered in the back of my mind, an itch I couldn't scratch. What kind of company needed confirmation of my existence? And why? That night, while brushing my teeth, I noticed something strange in the bathroom mirror. My reflection felt wrong. Not distorted, exactly, but delayed. When I moved my hand, it followed a fraction of a second too late. My movements weren't out of sync, but there was an eerie lag, like watching a poorly dubbed video. I waved a hand experimentally, and the reflection copied me. Perfectly. But my stomach churned, as if I caught something I wasn't meant to see. I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been working long hours and staring at screens too much. My eyes were playing tricks on me, I decided. But the next day, small things began to unravel. My phone refused to unlock with my face, though it had worked perfectly for years. I spoke to my neighbor in the hallway, Ms. Crowley, who had lived in the apartment next door since I moved in, and she introduced herself like we'd never met before. She even shook my hand. By the time I got to work, my ID badge wouldn't scan at the door. Security checked my photo against their system and waved me through, but I saw the way the guard squinted at the screen, her brow furrowed. I think our system's glitching, she muttered. I didn't argue. Then came the second email. Discrepancy detected. Please verify yourself again. There was no subject line this time, and the sender was blank. I stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure whether to respond. Against my better judgment, I typed, "What discrepancy?" The reply came instantly. "You are overlapping." The words sent a chill down my spine. I had no idea what it meant, but it didn't feel like a scam anymore. There was a weight to those 3 words, something final and inescapable. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I wasn't alone in my own head, like something was watching me from the inside out. The next day, my reflection was worse. It didn't just lag, it hesitated. When I looked at myself in the mirror, it took a full second before the face looking back caught up. And for that second, it wasn't mine. The features were familiar, but the eyes were wrong. They didn't blink when I blinked. I smashed the mirror with my fist. By the time the third email arrived, I wasn't surprised. Please proceed to your resolution point. No address, no instructions, just a phrase that felt both meaningless and absolute. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly. That evening, I decided to call my mother. I needed to hear someone who knew me, who could remind me that I was real, that I belonged. But when she answered, her voice was distant, detached. "Who is this?" she asked. "Mom, it's me, Ryan." There was a long pause. Then, "I don't have a son named Ryan." I hung up before she could say more, my breath hitching in my chest. It wasn't just her. None of my contacts recognized me. Friends I'd known for years treated me like a stranger. Even my landlord, who I paid in person every month, acted like he'd never seen me before. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was some elaborate prank or a glitch in my brain. But as I walked back to my apartment that night, I felt it, a presence. Not physical, but they're all the same, pressing against the edges of my awareness. When I got home, I found the envelope on my kitchen counter. I hadn't left it there. I hadn't even opened the counter. Inside was a photo of me, or someone who looked like me, sitting at a park bench I didn't recognize. My doppelganger was smiling, carefree, his posture relaxed. But behind him, in the shadow of a tree, was a figure. Tall, featureless, watching. On the back of the photo was a single line of text. Proceed to your resolution point, or we will resolve you. The next morning, I boarded a bus to nowhere. I didn't care where it took me, as long as it was far away. The world outside the window blurred into indistinct shapes as I tried to breathe through the growing sense of detachment. By the time I reached the end of the line, the streets were empty. The buildings were wrong, too perfect, like sets on a soundstage. I wandered until I reached a house I'd never seen before but knew intimately. It was waiting for me, door ajar, light spilling out like a wound. Inside, there was no furniture, no walls, just a single chair in the center of an endless black void. And sitting in that chair was me. Not a reflection, not a twin. Me. He, or I, looked up, eyes hollow but familiar. "It's about time," he said, his voice the perfect echo of mine. I tried to step back, but the void pulled me forward. The other me stood, holding out his hand. "You're the shadow," he said. "You don't belong here." His hand closed around my wrist, and the world dissolved into static. I don't remember what happened next, but when I woke up, I was sitting at the park bench, smiling at nothing, a stranger in my own skin. The man showed up at my doorstep on a Tuesday, just as the sky was turning that bruised shade of purple before a storm. I didn't recognize him, but he acted like he knew me. His clothes were plain, gray slacks, a white button-up, but his shoes were caked with red mud. He smiled, wide and too bright, like someone mimicking human behavior. "Delivery for you," he said, handing me a small package. I hadn't ordered anything, but my name and address were neatly printed on the label. I didn't see a truck parked nearby, and when I glanced back to thank him, or ask him who had sent it, he was gone. The package was heavier than it looked, about the size of a shoebox and wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address, just a faint smell of earth and something metallic. Inside was a cassette tape. I don't own a cassette player, but the tape was marked in black marker with a single word: listen. I set it on the counter, intending to forget about it. I couldn't explain the unease I felt, but I knew it was better left alone. Still, the tape sat there all evening, its presence weighing on me. By the time the storm hit, I couldn't take it anymore. A quick search through the attic turned up an old portable cassette player, buried under years of forgotten junk. The buttons were stiff, the speakers crackled when I plugged it in, but it worked. I pressed play. At first, there was only static. Faint, erratic hisses and pops, like distant radio signals. Then a voice emerged, distant and hollow, distorted as though coming from a great depth. "Do you remember the whole?" My hands froze over the player. The voice was slow, deliberate, but familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. It sounded like mine. "There is a hole. You left it behind. You thought it was gone, but it's still there." The tape clicked, stopped, and then rewound itself automatically. I didn't touch it. When it played again, the static was louder, and the voice was sharper, angrier. "Don't ignore it. You remember the hole." Images flickered in my mind, unbidden. Dirt under my nails, the smell of wet earth, the weight of a shovel in my hands. But the memory wasn't mine. I'd never dug a hole, not like that. Not anywhere that mattered. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the room in sudden flashes. I yanked the tape out of the player and threw it into the trash, heart racing. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I woke up at 3:12 a.m., the exact time glowing red on the clock, with the sound of faint scratching. It wasn't coming from the walls or the window, but from under the floorboards. I lay there, paralyzed, as the scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I didn't leave my bed until sunrise. When I finally ventured into the kitchen, I stopped cold. The cassette tape was back on the counter. "Listen." This time, I burned it. I took it to the sink, poured lighter fluid over the cassette, and lit a match. It caught quickly, the plastic bubbling and curling, the tape inside curling into charred ribbons. I watched it until it was nothing but ash. For 2 days, nothing happened. The scratching stopped, the air felt lighter, and I began to convince myself I'd imagined it all. Then the package came back. Same brown paper, same faint smell of dirt and metal. Inside was the cassette tape, pristine, as if I'd never touched it. But there was something else this time. A note, written on a scrap of what looked like old parchment. The handwriting was jagged and frantic, barely legible. You dug the hole. You must fill it. That night, I dreamed of a field. A vast, empty expanse of red clay stretching endlessly under a gray sky. In the center of it was a hole, deep, perfectly round, and impossibly black. I stood at the edge, looking down into it, and I swore I saw something staring back. When I woke up, my shoes were caked with red mud. I don't know where I went that night or how I got back, but the mud didn't lie. My feet ached, my hands were raw, and the smell of earth lingered in the air. The cassette tape played on its own the next morning. I found it spinning in the player I'd left in the attic, though no one could have touched it. "The hole isn't finished," the voice said. "It's waiting. I know better than to ignore it now. Tomorrow, I'll find the field. I'll find the hole, and I'll fill it." The first time I noticed something unusual, I was at the library. I'd gone there to escape the noise of my apartment complex. Too many kids, too many arguments spilling through the walls. The library was quiet, a sanctuary. I chose a desk near the back, wedged between tall shelves filled with books that hadn't been borrowed in years. I was flipping through a philosophy book, something dense and unapproachable, when I felt it. A shift in the air, subtle but insistent, like the faint pull of static before a lightning strike. I looked up, expecting to see someone standing too close, but the aisle was empty. When I turned back to the book, the words on the page were gone. Not smudged, not blurred, gone. The paper was blank, its surface smooth and clean as though it had never been printed. My pulse quickened. I flipped to the next page, and then the next, but the entire book was empty. I thought it might be a printing error. A misbound copy somehow slipped onto the shelves, but as I closed the book, I noticed the title had disappeared from the cover. It wasn't just blank, it was wrong. The book wasn't mine anymore. I left the library in a daze, my bag heavier than it should have been. I hadn't borrowed anything, but as I walked home, I could feel the weight pressing against my shoulder. When I reached inside, my hand brushed something cold and metallic, a small brass key I'd never seen before. It had no markings, no labels, just a simple, unadorned shape, slightly tarnished, its teeth sharp enough to catch my skin. That night, my dreams twisted into corridors of impossible architecture. Walls bent into spirals that looped back on themselves. Doors opened to reveal more doors, all of them painted the same shade of gray that seemed to deepen the longer I looked. At the end of one hallway was a figure with its back to me. When I woke, the key was on my pillow. I told myself I must have put it there without realizing, though I couldn't remember ever taking it out of my bag. It sat there, inert and unthreatening, but my chest tightened at the sight of it. The metal was warmer now, the tarnish polished away to a faint gleam. I didn't touch it again until the next evening. I was walking back from the store, my thoughts preoccupied with the mundane tasks of the day, when I saw the door. It was on a building that shouldn't have had one. A solid gray rectangle set into a brick wall that was otherwise windowless and bare. The key burned in my pocket, a gentle but insistent weight that I could no longer ignore. I approached slowly, half expecting someone to step out and ask me what I was doing. But the street was deserted, the kind of quiet that felt staged, like the world was holding its breath. The door didn't have a handle, just a small keyhole at eye level. My hand moved before my mind could object, sliding the key into the lock. It turned easily, almost eagerly, and the door swung inward without a sound. The room beyond wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a room at all. It was a field, stretching endlessly under a sky that didn't seem entirely real. The grass was too perfect, each blade standing at attention, its color too vivid to belong to the natural world. The air hummed faintly, carrying a metallic tang that settled on my tongue. In the distance, I saw a house, a small, weathered structure with a slanted roof and peeling paint. Smoke curled from its chimney, though the air was too still for it to rise naturally. The door swung shut behind me, and when I turned, it was gone. There was nothing to do but move forward. The house grew closer with each step, its details sharpening into unsettling clarity. The windows were clouded, as though something inside was pressing against the glass, breathing. The front door was slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. I hesitated at the threshold, my skin crawling with the feeling of being watched. Then the door creaked wider, inviting me in. Inside, the house was larger than it should have been. The walls stretched high and narrow, curving into arches that disappeared into shadow. The floor was smooth and cold, reflecting my image in distorted ripples. At the center of the room was a table. On it sat a single object, a mirror. The frame was simple, unpolished wood, but the surface of the mirror was alive. It rippled like water, shifting colors and shapes in a pattern I couldn't decipher. When I stepped closer, it stilled, and my own reflection appeared. Only it wasn't mine. The person staring back at me looked almost right. The same face, the same features, but their eyes were wrong. They were too bright, too knowing, and they didn't blink when I did. "Why are you here?" the reflection asked, its voice calm and distant, like an echo in a cave. I couldn't answer. "You don't belong," it said, leaning closer. The surface of the mirror rippled again, and the room seemed to tilt. "This place isn't yours." "I didn't mean to come," I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. "It doesn't matter. Now you're part of it." The mirror shattered, the pieces flying outward in slow motion, each shard catching the strange light of the house. When I woke, I was back in my apartment. The key was gone, and so was my reflection. Now, the mirrors in my apartment don't show me. They show the house, the door, the field, the sky, and sometimes, if I look long enough, I see the figure in the distance. It's waiting, and I don't know if it's waiting for me to return, or for something to come through. The first time I noticed the change was during a storm. Not the violent kind that rattles windows and soaks the streets, but one of those strange, muted storms where the air feels heavy and the sky takes on a strange, sickly green hue. The rain came in thin, steady sheets, tapping softly against the glass of my apartment window. I was sitting on the couch, flipping aimlessly through channels, half listening to the static-filled hum of the storm outside. Something shifted. It wasn't the rain or the thunder. Those stayed steady, their rhythms unbroken. What changed was the light in the room. It grew dimmer, not in the flickering way of a power surge, but as if the light itself was pulling away from the walls, retreating into the shadows. I stood up, uneasy, and walked to the window. Outside, the storm seemed the same. The streetlights glowed, the rain streaked the glass, and the familiar shapes of my neighborhood stretched out into the haze. But when I looked closer, I realized the streetlights weren't casting light anymore. They were on, but their glow didn't extend beyond the bulbs. It was like the world had forgotten how to illuminate itself. I turned back to the room. My television was still on, but the image on the screen had frozen, the static morphing into jagged shapes that looked almost like letters, though I couldn't read them. The storm buzzed louder in my ears, a low hum that felt less like sound and more like pressure. I reached for my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. I tried the light switch, but the bulb stayed stubbornly dim, as though it was fighting to exist. The only real light came from a single lamp in the corner, one I rarely used because it flickered when plugged in. Tonight, though, it burned steady, casting a faint golden glow across the carpet. That's when I noticed the box. It was small, wooden, and sat neatly in the center of the coffee table. I hadn't put it there. It wasn't mine. I approached it cautiously, my pulse quickening. The box was plain, unadorned except for a tiny brass latch. It looked old but well cared for, the wood polished to a dull sheen. I didn't open it at first. I circled it, studied it, looked for anything that might explain its presence. The hum of the storm grew louder. I knelt and touched the latch. It was warm, almost alive under my fingertips. With a small click, it opened, and the lid lifted slightly on its own, like it had been waiting for me. Inside was a photograph. It was black and white, grainy, and slightly curled at the edges. The image showed a street I didn't recognize, lined with buildings that seemed both impossibly old and unervingly precise. Every brick, every window pane, every shadow was too sharp, too deliberate, like it had been constructed with absolute care. At the center of the street stood a man. He was tall, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. His posture was stiff, his hands clasped behind his back, as though he were waiting for something or someone. The photograph wasn't still. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I watched, the shadows in the image shifted. The man tilted his head slightly, as if looking over his shoulder. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that he was moving, his form barely perceptible as he turned toward the camera. Toward me. I slammed the box shut and stepped back. The hum in the air was louder now, vibrating in my chest. The light from the corner lamp flickered, then steadied, its golden glow growing harsher, almost angry. The storm outside had stopped. The rain no longer tapped against the windows, and the low buzz of thunder had vanished. The silence was unbearable, stretching out like a taut wire. The television screen blinked once, twice, and then came to life. The same street from the photograph filled the screen, but this time it wasn't grainy or static. It was vivid, clear, and terrifyingly real. The man in the coat was there, standing in the exact same spot. He didn't move at first, but I felt his presence pressing against me, heavy and oppressive, as if he were standing in the room instead of the screen. He took a step forward. I stumbled backward, my knees hitting the coffee table. The box shifted slightly, and the lid creaked open, just enough for me to glimpse the photograph inside. The man in the image was gone. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned back to the screen. He was closer now, his face still hidden by the shadow of his hat. Another step, then another. The camera, or whatever was capturing the image, seemed to retreat, pulling back as the man advanced. I grabbed the remote and pressed every button I could, but the screen wouldn't turn off. I unplugged the television, but the image remained, steady and unblinking. The man was running now. He sprinted down the street, his coat billowing behind him, his form growing larger and clearer with every step. He was coming for me. The storm returned. Not outside, but inside. The hum exploded into a deafening roar, and the lamp in the corner shattered, plunging the room into darkness. I don't know how long I sat there, curled up on the floor, my hands covering my ears. When I finally looked up, the television was off. The room was silent, the air still. The box was gone. I've tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a waking nightmare, something I imagined in a moment of stress. But every night since, I've heard it. The faint hum of the storm, growing louder, closer, pressing against the walls. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see him. He's still running. And he's almost here. The house was the kind of place you inherited and immediately considered selling. My grandmother had lived there for decades, an aging Victorian tucked away in a pocket of pine forest just outside a town no one remembered unless they needed gas on the way somewhere else. It had character, people might say, with its sagging porch and windows that caught the light like secrets trapped behind glass. To me, it was just old and suffocating, full of musty furniture and shadows that seemed a little too comfortable. Still, when the lawyer handed me the deed and the keys, something in me felt tethered, as if the house was waiting for me specifically. I told myself I'd stay just long enough to clean it out and find a buyer. 2 weeks, maybe 3. The first night was uneventful, except for how still it was. No cars, no neighbors, just the quiet hum of the forest and the occasional groan of the house settling under its own weight. I spent most of the evening clearing cobwebs and dusting surfaces that hadn't been touched in years. Everything felt untouched, frozen in time. Her needlepoint project still sat in the corner, half finished, and the kitchen pantry was stocked with cans that expired before I was born. I didn't think much of it then, but there was no dust on the pantry shelves, none at all. It wasn't until I was unpacking my suitcase in the upstairs bedroom that I noticed the locked door at the end of the hall. I vaguely remembered it from childhood visits, a door that never seemed to open, but as a kid, you didn't question those things. It was simply off-limits, an adult boundary that didn't invite curiosity. Now, standing in front of it, I noticed the frame seemed newer than the rest of the house, the wood unweathered and smooth. There was no key in the lock, just the faintest scratching marks around the edges, as though someone had tried to force it open a long time ago. By the second night, The house began to feel less like an empty relic and more like something alive. It was in the little things. The sound of faint footsteps when I knew I was alone, the way the air grew colder in certain rooms, the shadows that didn't always align with their sources. I dismissed it as nerves or an overactive imagination. Old houses creaked, and the mind played tricks when the silence stretched too long. I told myself this over and over, but it didn't help when I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of humming. It was soft and distant, almost melodic, as though someone was singing to themselves from another room. I stayed in bed, listening, trying to convince myself it was the wind. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, I found nothing. No signs of anyone else, no source for the sound. The house was silent again, but the locked door seemed colder as I passed it, a faint chill radiating from the wood. The humming continued every night after that, always just beyond reach. It moved through the house, drifting up from the floorboards or down from the ceiling, never loud enough to follow. By the fourth night, I'd had enough. I searched the house for the key to the locked door, tearing through drawers and cabinets, but found nothing. I even called the lawyer, asking if he knew anything about it. He told me the same thing my grandmother used to say when I was a kid. That door was locked long before I ever knew her. Don't worry about it. Some things are better left closed. I decided to leave it alone, but the house had other plans. One morning, I woke to find the lock on the door broken. The metal was warped, bent outward as though something inside had pushed its way free. The door itself was ajar, just slightly, enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. I stood there for a long time, staring, my breath caught in my throat. I told myself not to open it, to leave it alone and call someone. Anyone. But my hand was already reaching for the knob. The room beyond was small and empty, the walls bare except for deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had clawed at them. The air was heavy, damp, and there was a faint smell of earth and rot. In the center of the room was a wooden chest, its surface carved with intricate symbols I didn't recognize. The carvings seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as though they were alive. I didn't want to go near it, but my legs moved anyway, carrying me across the threshold. When I lifted the lid, the humming stopped. Inside was a mirror, its surface dark and rippling like water. As I stared, my reflection began to change. At first, it was subtle, the angle of my head slightly different, my expression wrong. Then it started to move on its own, lips parting to form words I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and the lid slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the empty house. That night, I dreamed of the mirror. In the dream, I was standing in front of it, but it wasn't my reflection staring back. It was someone else, someone wearing my face like a mask, their eyes too bright and their smile too wide. When I woke, the chest was in my bedroom, the lid open. The days that followed were a blur of terror and confusion. The humming grew louder, constant, filling every corner of the house until it was impossible to think. I tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge, the windows refusing to open no matter how hard I pushed. The house held me like a fly trapped in amber. And the mirror, it began to show up everywhere, reflected in the glass of a picture frame, the surface of the kitchen sink, even the shadows on the walls. My reflection moved when I didn't, its gestures mocking mine, its smile growing sharper with each passing day. It whispered to me now, a voice that slithered into my thoughts no matter how I tried to block it out. "Let me out," it would say. "You don't need this life. Let me have it." I stopped sleeping. The mirror seemed to grow stronger the weaker I became, its presence expanding until it filled the entire house. I tried to destroy it, smashing the chest with a hammer, but the wood wouldn't splinter, the carvings glowing brighter with every strike. The harder I fought, the more it seemed to laugh, a sound that came not from the mirror but from within me. On the final day, I stood in front of the mirror, staring into the face that wasn't mine. It smiled at me, tilting its head like a predator studying prey. "You're tired," it said, its voice my own but warped. "You don't have to fight anymore. Just let me in." I don't remember saying yes, but I must have. When I woke, the house was quiet again. The humming was gone, the air still. The locked door was sealed, the chest nowhere to be found. For the first time, I felt free. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the face staring back. The first thing I noticed was the absence of sound. I live in a small, bustling apartment complex on the edge of the city. Normally, I can hear the muffled thrum of life through the walls. Music from the guy next door, footsteps on the stairs, the occasional shriek of a kettle boiling 2 floors down. But one night, as I sat in my living room scrolling through my phone, I realized the usual background noise had vanished. It wasn't quiet in the way the world is at 3 a.m. It was absolute, the kind of silence that presses against your skin and makes your pulse sound unnaturally loud. It wasn't just the building either. I went to the window and opened it, expecting to hear the hum of traffic from the main road. Nothing. No cars, no distant sirens, no voices. Just silence. I stayed up all night listening, the weight of the silence bearing down on me until I fell asleep at the kitchen table as dawn bled through the window. When I woke up, the sound had returned. My neighbors stomped up and down the stairs. A bus groaned at the corner stop, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to stress or a glitch in my brain. That laugh didn't last long. The second time it happened, 3 nights later, it was worse. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, when the lights flickered. A single, violent flash left an imprint of the room burned into my vision. When I blinked it away, the lights were steady again. But as I stared into the mirror, trying to shake off the jolt of unease, I realized I couldn't hear the electric hum of the bathroom fan. I stepped out into the hallway, toothbrush still in hand. Nothing. The apartment felt dead, hollowed out. I went to the front door and opened it, expecting to find some explanation, maybe a blackout or a bizarre citywide event. But what I saw was wrong. The hallway outside my door wasn't my building anymore. The walls were too smooth, glossy, with a faint sheen that reflected the dim, overhead light like water. The air smelled faintly metallic, sharp enough to sting. My neighbors' doors were gone, replaced by seamless panels that stretched endlessly in both directions. The toothbrush fell from my hand, clattering to the floor. The sound, or lack of it, made my stomach churn. I closed the door, heart pounding, and leaned against it. For a long moment, I just stood there, trying to convince myself that I was dreaming. When I finally found the nerve to open the door again, the hallway was back to normal. But the silence lingered. I started keeping notes after that, jotting down every detail in a notebook. I didn't know what else to do. The patterns weren't clear at first. The silence would come, then go, and each time it lasted longer. Sometimes it brought with it strange sights. The hallway that wasn't my hallway, or windows that didn't show the familiar street outside but vast, gray expanses of nothing. Other times, it was subtler. Small things in my apartment seemed misplaced. A chair slightly off-center. A book on the shelf I didn't remember buying. My own handwriting in my notebook would shift, the letters sharper, angrier, like someone else was trying to write through me. The last time it happened, I knew I couldn't stay. It began with the shadows. I was in the living room, trying to distract myself with a mindless TV show, when I noticed something odd. The shadows cast by the furniture weren't consistent with the light in the room. The couch's shadow stretched too far, curling toward the kitchen like an ink spill. The shadow of my lamp didn't even touch the wall behind it. It hung suspended, untethered, like it was afraid to attach itself. Then the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't stabilize. They pulsed, casting the room in rhythmic flashes of light and dark. And in the dark moments, I saw something moving. It wasn't a figure, not exactly. It was a distortion, like heat rising off pavement, but it was solid, its edges rippling with each flicker of light. It loomed in the corner, and though I couldn't see its face, or if it even had one, I felt its focus settle on me. The silence came back, heavier than before, crushing. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, my phone, and my keys and ran. The building felt endless as I sprinted for the stairs. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the walls narrowing the further I went. Doors I knew belonged to my neighbors were replaced by smooth, panel-like surfaces. The stairwell, when I found it, wasn't right either. The steps spiraled downward in impossible loops, the space between floors too wide, the air too thin. I forced myself to descend anyway, the silence wrapping tighter around me with each step. When I finally burst out into the street, I realized I'd left behind more than just the building. The city wasn't there. Instead, I stood on a flat, featureless plain. The sky was gray, no sun, no stars, just an oppressive, even light. The ground beneath my feet felt like stone, but it was too smooth, too cold, like polished marble. And then I heard it. Not a sound, but the absence of one. A low, resonant pulse that made my teeth ache and my bones vibrate. I turned, and the distortion was there, standing on the horizon. It had grown, its shape larger, more defined, though still flickering at the edges like a bad signal. It didn't chase me. It didn't need to. I ran anyway, but no matter how far I went, the landscape never changed. The horizon stayed flat, empty, the gray light unyielding. I've stopped running now. The silence is absolute, even inside my head. I'm writing this in the hope that someone, anyone, will find it, though I don't know where it will go. The distortion is closer now. It moves when I blink. I think it's waiting for me to stop. When I was a kid, my grandmother used to warn me about the liminal times, those in-between hours when the world supposedly straddles the line between the normal and the strange. Dawn and dusk, she'd say, were the most dangerous. That's when the rules loosen, she'd whisper, her voice low and conspiratorial, and things slip through. I always thought it was just folklore, something old-world people clung to as a way of explaining the inexplicable. But last week, in the soft orange light of dusk, I learned she wasn't entirely wrong. I was driving home from a work trip, following the kind of backroads that feel like they haven't changed in decades. The highway had been clogged with construction, so my GPS rerouted me through farmland and sparse, wooded patches. It was the kind of scenery that would have been beautiful in daylight, but under the encroaching shadow of evening, it took on a muted, eerie stillness. About 10 minutes into the detour, I noticed something odd. Every mailbox I passed had a red handprint smeared across it, like someone had dipped their palm in paint and slapped it on. The first few didn't register. I figured it was some local tradition, maybe a prank. But as the miles stretched on, the handprints became more erratic. Some were large and perfectly formed, others streaked, as if whoever made them had dragged their hand down the surface in a hurry. None of the houses had lights on, not even porch lamps. Just rows of darkened windows and those damned handprints. The road narrowed as it wove through a denser patch of woods, the trees crowding the edges like they wanted to swallow it whole. My headlights cut through the gathering gloom, and the GPS chirped an update. Continue straight for 14 miles. 14 miles of this? I cursed under my breath and glanced at the time. If I kept up my pace, I'd make it home just after sunset. It was then that I saw the man. He was standing on the side of the road, just where the trees thinned into a clearing. At first, I thought he was a hitchhiker. He had that restless, almost predatory stillness people get when they're waiting too long. But as my car approached, I realized something was off. He wasn't trying to flag me down. He was just standing there, arms at his sides, staring into the woods. His clothes were filthy, caked in dirt, and he wasn't wearing shoes. I slowed down, just enough to get a better look, and that's when he turned. His face was pale, almost gray in the fading light, and his eyes were the strangest thing about him. They weren't panicked or pleading, the way you'd expect from someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. They were blank, empty, like he was looking past me, through me. The moment our gazes locked, I felt an icy dread curl in my stomach. He took a step toward the car, his bare foot crunching on the gravel. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. My foot hit the gas, and the car surged forward, the man shrinking into the rearview mirror. But even as the distance grew, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. A few miles later, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. The guy was probably just some unlucky soul who got lost or abandoned. Maybe he'd been drinking. I almost considered calling the local police, but my signal was spotty, and I didn't want to stop in the middle of nowhere. That's when I saw the second figure. This one was a woman, crouched low on the shoulder of the road. Her hair hung in dark, matted clumps over her face, and her hands were buried in the dirt like she was digging for something. My heart leapt into my throat as I swerved slightly to avoid her, my tires kicking up a spray of loose stones. She didn't react, didn't even look up. But in my rearview mirror, I swear I saw her head snap toward me as I drove away, her face obscured by her hair. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I was starting to feel like I'd stepped into some forgotten corner of the world, a place where normal rules didn't apply. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, and I pressed the gas harder, the speedometer creeping well past the limit. The road twisted and turned, the forest growing thicker, the light dimmer. And then the GPS chimed again. Take the next left. There was no left. I slowed, scanning the area. The only thing to my left was a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for a car, its entrance choked with weeds and brambles. My headlights caught a wooden sign nailed to a tree, its letters faded but still legible, Harrow Lane, Dead End. A chill ran down my spine. The GPS recalculated, insisting this was the route. I ignored it and drove straight, gripping the wheel tighter. But as I passed the entrance to Harrow Lane, I caught something in my peripheral vision. A figure standing just beyond the trees, its face obscured in shadow. The radio, which had been playing softly in the background, erupted into static. A voice crackled through, faint and distorted, but I couldn't make out the words. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fumbled with the dial, trying to turn it off. That's when the whispering started. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like wind threading through the trees. But it grew louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices overlapping, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I glanced at the back seat in the mirror, half expecting to see someone there, but it was empty. The road ahead was different now. The trees seemed closer, the branches arching overhead like claws. The air felt heavier, and the smell of damp earth filled the car. The headlights barely penetrated the gloom, and I could have sworn the shadows were moving, shifting along the edges of the beam. Then the figures returned. They lined the road, one by one, spaced a few yards apart. Men, women, and children, their faces blank, their clothes tattered. They didn't move as I drove past, but I felt their eyes on me, following every inch of my progress. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I kept my gaze locked on the road ahead, too afraid to look directly at them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the forest began to thin, and the road widened into a familiar stretch of highway. The GPS chirped cheerfully, rerouting. Continue for 12 miles. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, blank, pale, unblinking. I don't know what I stumbled into on that detour, but I've learned one thing for certain. Some roads weren't meant to be traveled, and some places aren't meant to be found. I first noticed the changes in the corners of my vision, like static in an old TV broadcast. At first, it was barely perceptible, a blur that vanished when I tried to focus on it. But it didn't stop there. The static began to linger, growing sharper and more deliberate, and it always seemed to hover in places I didn't expect. The shadow of a tree, the space between elevator doors, the curve of my bedroom ceiling. One evening, while sitting on my couch, I glanced at the wall across from me. The surface shimmered, faintly at first, then more intensely, like ripples on water. It wasn't a reflection, and it wasn't light leaking in from the window. It was something else entirely. I stood up, cautiously approaching, and for a moment, I swore the rippling surface bent inward, like the wall was breathing. Then it stopped, still and solid as if nothing had happened. By the time the strangers appeared, I had stopped trusting my surroundings. It wasn't just the static anymore. Small details in my apartment began to rearrange themselves. A chair slightly turned, a picture frame hanging just a few degrees askew, the clock on the stove frozen at impossible times like 25:98. I tried telling myself I was imagining it, but I wasn't. It was late on a Friday night when I saw the first figure. I had been working at my desk, headphones on, trying to drown out my anxiety with ambient music. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement by the doorway. A man stood there, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. He wasn't anyone I recognized, tall, dressed in something that looked too stiff to be clothing, his face a smudged blur like a photograph in motion. I froze, unsure if I was dreaming or hallucinating. Before I could speak, he raised a hand, not in greeting, but in warning. Then he took a single step backward, melting into the shadows. When I bolted to the door, he was gone. The hallway was empty, its silence ringing in my ears. That night, I barricaded myself in my bedroom with a chair wedged under the doorknob. Sleep didn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. The static returned, swirling in the corners of the room like faint whispers. When I finally drifted into a shallow sleep, I dreamed of that man, standing still as stone, staring at me from the end of an endless corridor. The strangers became a pattern. A woman appeared next, her silhouette softer but no less eerie, lingering outside my living room window. I lived on the 5th floor, and there was no balcony. When I looked closer, she was gone, leaving only the faintest impression of her figure in the condensation on the glass. I started seeing them everywhere. In the reflections of shop windows, standing in the background of crowds, disappearing the moment I blinked. I began documenting their appearances, keeping a notebook filled with crude sketches and timestamps. The static grew louder with each encounter, crackling in the spaces they left behind. Soon, it wasn't just confined to my apartment. It followed me to work, to the grocery store, even on a weekend trip to the beach where I'd hoped to escape. Always just out of reach, always dissolving when I tried to confront them. Then, one day, they stopped hiding. I was sitting in the kitchen, eating breakfast, when a figure appeared across from me at the table. There was no grand entrance, no noise or flicker of light. He was simply there. He wore the same stiff, unearthly clothing as the first man, and his face was still a blur, but his posture was unnervingly casual. He tilted his head, as if observing me in return. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand passing through the ceramic mug in front of him like smoke. The mug trembled slightly, then steadied. I watched, transfixed, as the rippling started again. Not on the wall this time, but in the air around him. He leaned forward, the static intensifying, and then he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The words vibrated through the air, too deep and distorted to feel human. Before I could respond, he vanished, leaving the chair rocking slightly as though someone had just stood up. I didn't leave my apartment for the next 3 days. The notebook I had been keeping disappeared entirely, and in its place was a single scrap of paper. The handwriting wasn't mine, but it was close enough to make my chest tighten. "Stop looking. You don't belong." The world began to feel increasingly artificial after that. Streets seemed to loop endlessly, taking me back to the same corner no matter how far I walked. Conversations with coworkers repeated word for word, as if they were stuck on a script. Even the weather turned uncanny. Rain fell in perfect, uniform droplets, stopping mid-air when I reached out to touch them. One evening, desperate for answers, I decided to return to the place where it had all begun, the shimmering wall in my living room. I stood in front of it, heart racing, and pressed my hand against the surface. This time, it gave way, folding around my fingers like liquid. I stepped forward, and the air grew thick and heavy, pulling me through. On the other side was a space I can only describe as unfinished. The ground beneath my feet was solid but featureless, a smooth expanse of pale gray stretching in all directions. The sky, or what passed for it, was a swirling mass of static, alive with faint whispers I couldn't quite decipher. The strangers were waiting, dozens of them, standing in a loose circle around me, their blurry faces now faintly illuminated by the static above. One stepped forward, their movements fluid yet disjointed, like an animation missing key frames. "You've seen too much," they said, their voice a hollow echo. "This place wasn't meant for you." "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why am I here?" They didn't answer. Instead, the static around them intensified, the air buzzing with an almost unbearable frequency. Then the ground began to dissolve beneath me, fracturing into jagged pieces of light and shadow. I fell, tumbling through the void as the whispers grew louder. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. Everything was as it had been before. The walls solid, the air still. But something was missing. The world felt quieter, emptier, like a stage after the actors have left. And in the corner of my vision, the static lingered, faint but unyielding. It never truly left. On Tuesday morning, my apartment door wouldn't open. I'd locked it the night before, the deadbolt turning smoothly as always. But now, no matter how much I twisted the knob or jiggled the lock, the door wouldn't budge. It wasn't stuck in the frame, either. It felt solid, immovable, as if the wood had become part of the wall itself. I stepped back and looked at it. Everything seemed normal. The brass numbers gleamed in the weak light filtering through the window behind me. The peephole reflected back a tiny, warped version of my living room. But the more I stared, the more I felt it wasn't my door anymore. There was no panic yet, only confusion. I tried the windows, but they were sealed shut, the locks refusing to turn even when I pressed my full weight against them. The air in the room seemed heavier than usual, like the atmosphere had thickened while I slept. I called my landlord. He picked up on the second ring, his voice crackling like an old vinyl record. "Doors jammed?" he repeated after I explained. "No," I said, trying to put it into words. "It's not jammed. It just won't open." There was a long pause. I thought the line had gone dead until he muttered, "You're not on my list." "You're what?" "Hang tight," he said quickly, and then the call ended. I stared at my phone, unsure if I should laugh or scream. My landlord was eccentric, sure, but this was a new level of weird. The day stretched on, and the walls began to feel closer. I tried to distract myself, tidying up the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, even attempting to nap. But there was a subtle, gnawing sensation in the back of my mind. Something was off. It was around 4 in the afternoon when I noticed the first change. I'd set my mug of tea on the counter, directly on top of a coaster. When I reached for it a few minutes later, the mug was still there, but the coaster was gone. I checked the sink, the floor, even the trash can, but it was nowhere to be found. I tried to shake it off. Things disappear all the time. But then it happened again. The bookshelf in the corner was full of books I'd collected over the years, arranged in a loose, haphazard order. When I glanced at it now, the entire bottom shelf was empty. I crouched down, running my hand along the space where the books should have been, as if touching it would make them reappear. They didn't. By evening, more things had vanished. A jacket from the coat rack, the rug in front of the sofa, a spoon I'd left in the sink. My apartment was slowly hollowing itself out, piece by piece. I tried calling my landlord again. This time, the call didn't connect. At some point, the lights flickered and dimmed, casting the room in a strange, wavering half-light. I avoided looking at the shadows too closely. They seemed to move, shifting slightly when I wasn't paying attention. Around midnight, I gave up trying to sleep. I sat in the middle of the living room, my back against the couch, holding my phone like a lifeline. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. Then, the knock came. It was soft, tentative, like someone tapping on glass. I froze, my eyes darting to the door. The knock came again. This time, it wasn't the door. It was coming from the hallway mirror. I didn't want to look, but my body moved on its own, drawn forward like a marionette. The mirror was tall and narrow, framed in dark wood, its surface slightly warped from age. Something was wrong with the reflection. The room behind me was distorted, stretched in impossible ways. The couch loomed larger than it should, the ceiling curving upward into darkness that didn't exist. And then there was the figure. It stood just behind me, close enough that I should have felt its breath on my neck. But when I turned, the room was empty. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer now, its face obscured by the same shadowy distortion that warped the rest of the reflection. The knock came again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't knocking on the glass. It was knocking on me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The reflection rippled, the figure dissolving into the darkness behind it. The lights in the apartment buzzed and flared, then went out entirely. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the apartment was unrecognizable. The furniture had rearranged itself in patterns that defied logic. Chairs stacked precariously on top of tables. The fridge rotated to face the wall. The air was thick with the scent of salt and metal, a tang that made my throat itch. And then the door opened. It didn't creak or groan. It simply swung inward, revealing a hallway that wasn't mine. The walls were smooth, white, and endless, stretching into a horizon that didn't make sense in the context of the building. I didn't want to step through, but I didn't have a choice. Behind me, the apartment began to crumble. The walls bent inward, folding like paper, the ceiling collapsing into itself. I stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind me, and when I turned, it was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lit by a pale, sourceless glow. I walked. I'm still walking. The walls have started to change now, shifting between colors and textures, patterns flickering like static on a screen. I've passed other doors, but they won't open. Sometimes, I hear the knock again, echoing faintly in the distance. I think it's following me. I didn't think much of the email at first. It was one of those sent to the wrong person messages that sometimes pop up in your inbox. No subject line, no sender name, just a random string of characters as the address. It didn't go to my spam folder, though, which was strange. And it wasn't the usual phishing nonsense or weird sales pitch. Just one sentence. You forgot something in room 242. I stared at it for a minute, trying to remember if I'd been to a place with a room 242 recently. A hotel? A conference? Nothing came to mind. Still, I was curious enough to check the email headers, see if it was some elaborate scam. But there was nothing. No IP address. No server trail. Just the message. I deleted it and moved on with my day. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, my phone buzzed. Another email from the same address. This time, the subject line read, "Come back to room 242. I ignored it. Whatever it wasn't my problem. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming, each one more insistent than the last. You need to return to room 242. You left it behind. You know what it is. Room 242 is waiting. I delete them as soon as they arrived, but they just reappear. Sometimes seconds later, sometimes in the middle of the night. They always slip through my filters, no matter how many blocks I put in place. By the end of the week, I'd stopped checking my inbox altogether. That's when the dreams began. In the first one, I was walking down a long, empty hallway. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, the kind you'd see in an old hotel, and the carpet squelched under my shoes as if it was soaked. There were doors on either side of me, each one marked with a brass number. I couldn't make out the numbers at first, but as I walked, they became clearer. 238, 239, 240. I woke up just as I reached 241. The dreams came back the next night, and the next. Always the same hallway, always the same slow, inevitable walk toward room 242. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. The wallpaper began to peel, revealing dark, pulsing shapes beneath. The carpet grew wetter, the squelching louder. The air smelled of mildew and something sharper, like copper. By the fourth night, I was standing outside the door. The brass numbers gleamed in the dim light. My hand reached for the doorknob, shaking, but I woke up before I could turn it. The emails changed after that. They stopped asking me to come back and started knowing things. Details no one else could have known. You left your keys on the counter this morning. You didn't lock the bathroom window. Don't forget the anniversary flowers in the trunk. Each one was accurate, down to the smallest detail. The kind of detail that made me check over my shoulder and double lock every door in my apartment. I started keeping the lights on at night, but it didn't help. The hallway from my dreams seeped into my waking hours. I'd see flashes of it when I closed my eyes. Dark walls, damp carpet, a brass 242 gleaming in the distance. Sometimes I'd hear faint footsteps behind me, soft and squelching, though I was always alone. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open. I never leave it open. The air felt colder than it should have been, and my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Another email. Room 242 is ready for you. I didn't delete this one. Instead, I opened it. The body of the email was blank, except for an attachment, a video file. My hands trembled as I clicked on it. the screen filling with grainy, black and white footage. It was the hallway. The camera was positioned at the far end, pointed toward room 242. The walls were damp, the carpet soaked through. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the door creaked open. I leaned closer, trying to make out what was inside. But the screen glitched, the image distorting into static. When it cleared, the camera had moved. It was no longer in the hallway. It was inside the room, facing a single chair in the center of the space. The chair was empty, but there was something in the shadows beyond it. Something that shifted and moved, just out of focus. The video ended abruptly. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to take action. I searched for room 242 online, desperate for any clue about what it was or where it might be. But every lead was a dead end. It was as if the room existed in some liminal space, just out of reach. The final email arrived that afternoon. Come to room 242, or we'll come to you. That night, I dreamt of the hallway again. But this time, I didn't wake up before opening the door. The knob was cold under my hand, and the door swung open easily, revealing a room that shouldn't have been possible. The walls pulsed like they were alive, oozing dark liquid. The chair from the video sat in the center, and the figure in the shadows stepped forward, just enough for me to see its outline. It was me, or something wearing my face. Its smile was too wide, its eyes too empty. You forgot something, it said in my voice, stepping closer. You can't leave without it. When I woke up, my body ached, as if I'd been walking all night. My apartment smelled faintly of mildew, and the soles of my feet were damp. My inbox was empty, but on my desk, where my laptop used to be, was a brass plaque. Engraved on it, in perfect script, were the words, Room 242. It began with the ceiling fan. I moved into the apartment 3 weeks ago. The fan in the bedroom didn't work when I arrived, but the landlord assured me it was an easy fix. Just a loose connection, he said, waving me off when I asked if I should call someone to repair it. I wasn't handy, but I thought I'd give it a shot before I hired an electrician out of pocket. When I removed the base plate to check the wiring, I found something strange. A slip of paper curled up inside the fixture. It was brittle, discolored with age, and covered in faint handwriting. I unfurled it carefully, squinting at the faded ink. You'll hear them before you see them. Don't let them in. I sat on the edge of the bed, the note dangling between my fingers. It was probably some weird joke left by a previous tenant, I told myself. People did all sorts of odd things in rental properties. Stuffed time capsules in the walls, scratched initials into the backs of cabinets. Still, something about the message nagged at me. The ceiling fan stayed broken. That night, I heard a faint knock at my door. Not the firm rapping of a visitor, but a soft, deliberate tap tap tap, like the knuckles of someone who wasn't sure they wanted to be heard. It was nearly midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated before checking the peephole. No one was there. The hallway was empty, still and silent except for the flickering buzz of the fluorescent lights. I opened the door a crack, peering down the corridor, but there was nothing, just the faint scent of mildew hanging in the air. When I closed the door, I noticed it. A second note slipped beneath the threshold. This one was shorter. They'll try again. I locked the deadbolt. Over the next few days, the knocks came like clockwork. Always late at night. Always soft, insistent. I stopped answering the door. Whoever, or whatever, was knocking never left a package, never spoke, never made a sound beyond that rhythmic tapping. More notes began to appear. They turned up in impossible places. Inside my refrigerator, tucked into my laundry, even sealed into a box of cereal I hadn't opened yet. Each one carried a variation of the same message. They're getting closer. Don't let them touch you. Keep the lights on. By the end of the week, I was barely sleeping. Every knock, every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes sent my heart racing. I started leaving the television on at night, the soft glow of sitcom reruns washing over the apartment like a feeble shield. Then the noises changed. It wasn't just the knocks anymore. I started hearing whispers, faint and crackling, like static from a distant radio. The voices weren't distinct, but they carried a tone that felt wrong, mocking, playful, but empty. They moved through the apartment, just on the edge of hearing, always staying out of sight. I called the landlord to ask if the building had any history. He laughed. "You've got one of the newer units," he said. "Nothing's happened there." When I pressed him, asking about the other tenants, he paused. "There's no one directly above or below you," he admitted. "It's a weird layout, but you've got neighbors on either side." "Why?" I didn't tell him about the knocking. The next night, I woke to the sound of something scraping against the bedroom window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, far too high for anyone to reach without a ladder. Still, the sound was unmistakable, nails dragging down the glass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there, frozen, staring at the shadowy outline of the window as the sound continued. Then, slowly, the scraping stopped, replaced by a soft tapping. I forced myself to look. A handprint was pressed against the glass, larger than any human hand I'd ever seen. It lingered for a moment before fading, as though the fingers had been made of smoke. I didn't sleep after that. The notes became more frantic. The handwriting, once neat and deliberate, grew jagged and erratic, as if written in haste. "You can't stop them. They know you've seen them. Get out." I packed a bag the next morning, ready to leave, but when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The locks turned freely, the chain slid back easily, but the door itself wouldn't open. It felt as if something on the other side was holding it shut. The whispers grew louder that night, no longer hiding in the corners of the apartment. They circled me, coming from the walls, the ceiling, even the air itself. Shadows danced where there was no light, stretching and twisting like living things. At some point, I must have blacked out, because I woke up in the living room. The notes scattered around me like fallen leaves. One stood out from the rest. It wasn't written in the same hand. The letters were bolder, slashed across the page with furious intent. "They've been invited." I don't know what I did to invite them. Maybe it was opening the first note. Maybe it was looking out the window. But now, they're here. The knocks have stopped, replaced by something worse, breathing. I can feel it, hot and damp against my neck, even when there's no one there. My reflection in the bathroom mirror doesn't quite move with me anymore. The ceiling fan, still broken, spins lazily when the air is still. The whispers aren't whispers anymore. They're laughter. The package arrived on a Monday, nestled on the top step of my porch like it had always belonged there. It was a box, heavy and plain, its cardboard surface battered as though it had been handled too roughly on its journey. There was no return address, no sender, just my name, printed in bold black letters across the top in handwriting that wasn't familiar, but somehow made my chest tighten. I didn't order anything, I thought. I picked it up carefully, half expecting it to move or emit a sound, and brought it inside. Setting it on the kitchen table, I hesitated. Something about the weight of the box, the way it felt more solid than it should, made me reluctant to open it. But curiosity always wins, doesn't it? Inside, wrapped in layers of yellowed newspaper, was an old camera, a bulky, black film camera that looked like it had been pulled from someone's attic and wiped down just enough to pass as salvageable. There was no note, no explanation, just the camera, staring up at me with its glass lens like an unblinking eye. I turned it over in my hands, inspecting it. The leather strap was frayed, the metal parts flecked with rust, but the inside was pristine. A fresh roll of film was already loaded, its advanced lever ready for the next shot. It felt deliberate. I should have put it back in the box, called someone, anyone, and asked them what the hell was going on. But I didn't. Instead, I lifted the viewfinder to my eye. Through the lens, my living room looked sharper, cleaner. The mundane clutter, a sweater thrown over the back of a chair, a mug sitting forgotten on the coffee table, seemed arranged, purposeful, framed perfectly, as though my life had become art without me noticing. Then the light in the viewfinder shifted. Something passed behind me, a shadow, quick and faint, gone before I could lower the camera. My breath caught. I stood frozen, listening to the silence of the house, but nothing moved. It was empty, just me. Still, I set the camera down and stepped away from the table, suddenly hyper-aware of the walls around me. The day passed in a haze of unease. Even Max, my lazy cat, seemed more alert, staring at corners of the room where there was nothing to see. I told myself to forget the package, to let it sit untouched until I figured out what to do with it. But by nightfall, the camera had found its way back into my hands. I took the first photo at sunset. My backyard, bathed in orange and gold, looked impossibly vivid through the viewfinder. I snapped the picture, the click of the shutter strangely loud in the quiet. For a moment, the lens seemed to linger on something, a pale shape near the edge of the frame. But when I looked again, it was gone. The next morning, the photo was waiting for me. I hadn't developed the film. I hadn't done anything with it. Yet there it was, sitting on the table beside the camera. A perfect, glossy print of the image I'd taken. My backyard, glowing with the warmth of sunset. But in the far corner, blurred but unmistakable, was a figure. It was barely visible, as though it were standing just outside the boundary of the frame. A woman, pale and thin, with dark hair falling around her face. Her features were indistinct, but her eyes, those I could see clearly. They stared directly at the camera, directly at me. I couldn't explain it. I wanted to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a reflection, something natural and boring. But her eyes, I knew those weren't an accident. I should have stopped then. I should have thrown the camera away, burned it, anything. But I didn't. Something about the photo, the sharpness of her gaze, made me feel like I needed to keep going. Like there was a question hidden in those eyes, and I wouldn't be able to sleep until I found the answer. So I started taking more photos. The park near my house, the empty street at night, even the hallway leading to my bedroom. Each one was ordinary in the moment, calm, quiet scenes of nothingness. But the prints were different. She was in every one, always at the edges, half hidden behind trees or doors, her pale figure blending into the shadows. And always watching. By the end of the week, my dining table was covered in prints. They felt like a map I couldn't read, fragments of a story I wasn't meant to understand. Her figure became clearer with each photo, stepping closer to the center of the frame. I tried to stop, but every time I told myself to put the camera down, I felt that gaze pulling at me, demanding more. The last photo I took was in my living room. I don't know why I did it, maybe because it felt like the only place left that was mine. When the print appeared the next morning, my hands shook as I lifted it. There she was, standing in the middle of the room, no longer blurred, no longer on the edges. Her face was sharp, every detail etched with precision. Her eyes, hollow and endless, seemed to reach out of the photo and into me. I dropped the print, backing away from the table. My heart thundered as I turned, expecting to see her standing there in the flesh. But the room was empty, or so I thought. That night, I locked the camera in the box and shoved it into the back of my closet. But it didn't matter. When I woke in the middle of the night, I wasn't alone. The air in my bedroom was heavy, the shadows thicker than they should have been. And then I saw her. She stood at the foot of my bed, her face obscured by the darkness, but I knew it was her. The shape of her body, the tilt of her head, it was unmistakable. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then she stepped forward, just enough for the faint moonlight to catch her face. "You kept looking," she whispered, her voice like the scrape of film unraveling from its reel. "So now, I'll look too." The next morning, the camera was back on the table. I don't know how it got there. I don't know if it matters. I haven't picked it up again, but I can feel it watching me. Or maybe it's her. Maybe it's always been her. The glass had been cracked for weeks, but now it was splitting. A jagged line ran from the corner to the center, fracturing the view of the world outside into mismatched shards. Rain slid down the surface, weaving through the break like it was tracing a hidden map. Naomi stared at it from her chair, the one with the sagging cushion she'd been meaning to replace, and wondered how long the pain could hold before it gave way completely. She didn't want to fix it. Not really. There was something captivating about the flaw, the way it caught the light at odd angles, scattering patterns across the room. The cracks weren't just cracks, they were deliberate, alive in a way the unbroken glass had never been. Still, the draft was getting worse, and with the storm rolling in, she knew it was only a matter of time before the wind decided for her. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. She glanced at the clock, 10:47 p.m. Nobody knocked this late. The sound came again, sharper this time, and she hesitated before standing. The hallway light flickered as she reached for the doorknob, her fingers brushing the cold metal. When she opened it, the porch was empty. She stepped out, the rain immediately soaking her socks. The street lamp at the corner flickered weakly, casting jittery shadows over the sidewalk. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the mud, no car parked nearby. But there, at the edge of the porch, was a package. Small, wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with string. No address, no markings. Naomi bent to pick it up, the rain running in rivulets down her arm. The package was heavier than it looked, solid in a way that didn't feel quite right. She carried it inside, kicking the door shut behind her, and set it on the table. For a moment, she just stared at it, her breath clouding faintly in the chilly air. It wasn't curiosity that made her untie the string. It was the weight, an almost magnetic pull that demanded to be dealt with. The paper fell away easily, revealing a box made of dark wood, smooth to the touch, with a small brass latch. She hesitated. Something about it felt old, not in the way antiques feel old, but ancient, as though it had existed long before anyone thought to carve it into its current shape. When she opened the lid, there was no flash of light, no ominous sound. Just a simple book, its cover blank, the edges of its pages gilded in gold, so faint it could have been a trick of the light. She lifted it out carefully, her fingers brushing the cover. It was warm, too warm. She opened it to the first page. "Write your question." That was all it said. 3 words, printed in neat, block letters at the top of the page. Beneath them was blank space, clean, unblemished, stretching endlessly. She flipped through the rest of the book, but every page was the same. Blank, save for that single instruction on the first. She closed it, the sound louder than it should have been in the quiet house. She thought about putting it back in the box, about tying the package up again and leaving it out in the rain for someone else to find. But as she stood there, the question formed unbidden in her mind. Why am I alone? It wasn't the kind of thing she'd normally ask. She was used to her solitude, even liked it most of the time. But tonight, with the storm pressing against the house and the cracked glass spilling its cold breath into the room, the question felt closer, sharper. Before she could stop herself, she reached for a pen. The ink sank into the paper like water into dry soil, disappearing almost instantly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the words began to appear, letter by letter, written in a hand that wasn't hers. "Because you asked to be." Her breath caught. She stared at the page, her mind scrambling for an explanation. A trick? A joke? But the handwriting didn't waver, didn't hesitate. It knew what it was saying. Naomi flipped the book shut, her pulse loud in her ears. The answer didn't make sense. She hadn't asked for this, had she? She tried to remember, but her thoughts felt fragmented, pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. The house groaned under the weight of the wind, and the cracked glass trembled in its frame. She opened the book again. The words were still there, staring up at her like a challenge. Her hand shook as she wrote her next question. What did I ask for? The answer came faster this time. To forget. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing closer. She dropped the book onto the table, stepping back as though it might come alive. Her breath was shallow now, her chest tight. Forget what? She didn't know. She didn't want to know. But the words pulled at her, a thread unraveling something deep inside. The glass shattered. She whipped around just in time to see the window give way, the wind roaring into the room like a living thing. The rain soaked everything instantly, drenching the table, the chair, the book. She reached for it instinctively, her fingers closing around the wet cover, but the pages were already moving, flipping on their own, faster and faster until the book was nothing but a blur of gold-edged paper. And then it stopped. The final page was different. The writing was her own. She recognized the curve of the letters, the way the ink dragged slightly at the ends of her strokes. It was a list. Names, dates, places she didn't recognize but felt she should. At the bottom, scrawled in a hand more frantic than the rest, was a single sentence. You chose this life to escape the other. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. The wind tore at the curtains, the rain pooling around her knees, but she barely noticed. She stared at the book, at the words she didn't remember writing but knew were hers. The house groaned again, louder this time, and the lights flickered. The book began to hum, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through her chest. She wanted to close it, to throw it, to do anything but look at the words staring back at her. But she couldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the hum stopped. The wind died. The rain slowed. The house fell silent. The book was dry. The glass was whole. The storm was gone. Naomi sat on the floor, the book closed in her lap, and stared at her reflection in the unbroken window. The cracks in her memory, though, were still there. And now, she wasn't sure she wanted to fix them.